Police have launched a murder inquiry after an elderly woman was found dead at her home in Fleckney.
I was gobsmacked. There's something could happen like this, literally on my doorstep.
This case was one of a kind. Not only the nature of it, but the brutal nature of it.
When I found out, it just floored me. How? Why could that happen?
This is an old lady who's been murdered and seriously sexually assaulted in her home.
How could somebody that I'd grown up with be capable of doing something like that?
A lot of people were generally scared.
This just doesn't look right.
There was no sign of forced entry, so it was obvious that it was somebody that she knew.
Open the door!
Right, at this moment in time, I'm arresting suspicion of murder.
Seven miles south of Leicester, in the heart of the English countryside, lies the quaint village of Fleckney.
Fleckney is a quiet village. It's very close-knit. It's like it has its own little bubble. People are very, very close. Everybody knows everybody. Most people are related in Fleckney.
Beautiful rural settings, friendly people, local community is fantastic. But yeah, lovely, lovely place to live and grow up in.
It's not the sort of place where a lot of crime happens. I'd been to Fleckney a few times. That had nothing to do with crime. I'd been there to judge a talent contest. I think it was called Fleckney's Got Talent.
The people who live in Fleckney are generally well-to-do. It's quite a low-crime area. There are retiring people there. There's some retirement bungalows around there. There's not a lot of throughfare. The people who are in Fleckney are generally the people who live there rather than the people who visit there.
And it was this perfect, idyllic village that 72-year-old Jane Hings chose to retire to.
Jane was an only child, and her mum and dad sadly passed away years before, which left her on her own with no immediate family around. Jane was quite a private person. She didn't like everyone to know, her business, and kept herself to herself, really. But once you got to know her, she opened up more, and it was just fun. She had quirky ways about her, but she was kind and she was caring.
Everybody in Fleckney knew Jane. She relied on people to give her a lift to the hairdressers, to the shops, things like that. She was inoffensive in every way. People didn't have bad things to say about her. And in her life beforehand, she worked hard.
Jane took pride in her appearance. She'd always, regular having her hair done every few weeks, and she'd always sort of make sure she was nicely dressed and put on a bit of makeup, so she'd still try and make the effort to look nice.
Having worked overseas as a nanny, Jane had settled into retirement, whilst also taking care of her much-loved rescue dog, Paddy.
He was spoilt rotten. Everything she did was for Paddy. You'd go in, there'd be dog treats stacked up to the ceiling. We'd lie on a bed at night and could look with her.
Whilst Jane used friends and neighbours to help walk Paddy, in the summer of 2017, an accident meant she needed a lot more care.
Goodbye. Jane had a fall and was admitted to hospital for about 3 or 4 weeks.
She'd suffered some injuries when her dog Paddy had pulled her over, and then when she came out of hospital, that's when she needed the carers and she needed help in getting around, and she couldn't go very far.
But the community came together for Jane, and she slowly got back on her feet.
She was the sort of person that people warmed to, they liked her, and they were happy to help out.
Then, just a few weeks after leaving hospital, tragedy strikes.
On the Sunday morning, Jane's carers went in as they were meant to, about 7 o'clock in the morning. Jane's front door was unlocked, which is normal. They went in. She was laid in bed. The cover was pulled up over her head and both of her arms were raised above her head. When they peeled back the duvet, which had covered her head entirely, they saw that she had died.
The carers are puzzled that Jane's body is covered completely by the duvet and call for an ambulance. Then, they notice something else unusual. Items are out of place in Jane's usually meticulous house.
And when the ambulance arrived, they could see that she'd been dead for some time. And the paramedic who was there, he looked around and could see that there'd been an untidy search. Some drawers were open, some things were knocked over.
Items were strewn across the floor, drawers were open.
Here is a lady who's died with the cover over her head, with the arms raised above the head, and it looks like there's been a burglary that's taken place.
With police at the scene, suspicions grow that this is not a natural death, and the house is immediately cordoned off. But with no obvious injuries, how Jane died is still a mystery, which means detectives begin to theorise what could have happened to the pensioner.
Is it a burglary that's gone wrong? Is it Jane who's suffered a heart attack following a burglary, or whether she has passed away and then a burglary has happened afterwards, or whether this is somebody who has murdered Jane and then burgled the bungalow afterwards?
The first step for detectives is to establish how Jane died.
I received a phone call from the duty detective inspector who said they had a death. They weren't 100% happy with it, and they would value my opinion on what was going on.
Dr. Hamilton attends the scene, and as well as the unusual way Jane has been tucked into her bed, his suspicions are raised further.
And the most immediately concerning thing was that her nightdress appeared to be pulled up, and that seemed very unusual for somebody who'd simply died in their sleep. But this just doesn't look right, it doesn't look normal.
As suspicions are raised that she could have been the victim of a sexual attack, Jane is taken for post-mortem. But almost immediately, everything changes.
This is HFM.
Police have launched a murder inquiry after an elderly woman was found dead at her home in Fleckney. Her body was discovered in a bungalow on Elizabeth Road. It's thought the victim died at some point during Saturday evening or in the early hours of Sunday.
Whilst transporting Jane, a shocking piece of evidence has been found.
As we took the body, a tongue bar fell from one of the creases in the skin. Ms. Hings didn't have a tongue piercing, so we have evidence of somebody else very close to her body. That ultimately became one of the most important pieces of evidence in catching the killer.
On a quiet Sunday morning in the village of Fleckney in Leicestershire, residents are waking up to disturbing news of a possible murder on their doorstep.
This is HFM.
Further tests are being carried out to try to determine what killed an elderly woman in her own home in Fleckney. It prompted police to launch a murder inquiry following the discovery of her body in the property on Elizabeth Road. There were signs of a disturbance in her bungalow, which has led officers to believe she may have been the victim of a burglary.
72-year-old Jane Hings has been found dead by her carers early on a Sunday morning. Her house has been burgled, and there's signs she has been sexually assaulted. Police are treating her death as suspicious and have cordoned off the scene.
There was police tape from the tree round to the lamppost. You couldn't get to where, if you can just see that red car behind this thing, that was all blocked off as well, because that's the back of her house. It's not something we expected to ever happen in Fleckney. It's such a quiet village, a nice village. I was gobsmacked. There's something could happen like this, you know what I mean? On my doorstep, literally on my doorstep. And for people that I knew.
It's a place where you could leave your doors and windows open. Everybody knows everybody. But, you know, this sent shockwaves through the community. And I think that a lot of people would have felt generally scared.
With the village inundated with police vehicles, Jane's loved ones are also confronted with the news of her death.
I'd arranged to go over to Jane's on the Sunday morning to take Paddy for a walk. And as usual, I was running late and I'd had no phone call, which was really strange. And then I pulled into the close where she lived and just saw loads of police cars, police vans, forensics, and yeah, that's when I found out. So I last spoke to Jane the night before. I was supposed to go and see her that day. I'd been on holiday, so I hadn't seen her for a couple of weeks. And we were on the phone for about an hour. I miss Jane. I miss the phone calls. There was so much she could have talked about her life, and I didn't get to hear any of it. And my phone is so deadly quiet all the time.
Whilst moving Jane's body, pathologists have discovered a tongue bar in her groin.
The investigation then shifted from, is this a burglary that's gone wrong, to this is an old lady who's been murdered and seriously sexually assaulted in her home.
That tongue bar was put into an evidence bag immediately. Everyone knew that this was potentially important. That went straight off. It was fast-tracked through the DNA lab.
As detectives wait for the DNA results, upmost on their mind is that this might not be an isolated incident.
One of our first lines of inquiry is to research cases of a similar nature, and we conducted a number of checks looking at anybody who was already convicted and in prison who could have been on day release for the same offence. But then this case was one of a kind. Not only the nature of it, but the brutal nature of it.
Immediately, door-to-door inquiries begin.
When officers initially attended the scene, they tried to identify people who would know Jane the last time that she was seen or spoken to.
Officers investigate whether Jane had any enemies in the village.
When we looked at Jane's past, there was no fallouts with anybody. There was nothing to indicate somebody with a vendetta, somebody with a grudge, any past history with anybody which would tell us this person has a long-running grudge against Jane and would want ill of her.
But locals have their own suspicions.
When the police first came, they said there was no sign of forced entry or anything like that, so it was obvious that it was somebody that she knew.
And it appears that whoever stole from Jane took some of her most precious items. Her wedding ring and a necklace are missing, along with her mobile phone, handbag, and £200. But police find an item they suspect doesn't belong to her.
Behind that bed, between the headboard and the wall, was a baseball cap found on the floor.
It was a designer cap, something that didn't belong to Jane.
The question police want to know is, whose hat is it? And did its owner have anything to do with Jane's death? With the post-mortem results in, it's apparent Jane has suffered a brutal attack.
Really tellingly, she had lacerations, she had tears, both to her anus and to her vagina. The external injuries were really focused around the mouth and the nose and the upper neck area. Ms. Hings didn't have that many injuries on her body, but what there was told a story. There was a little linear graze, a scratch on her neck, and we know that her necklace was missing. It would certainly fit with somebody having pulled that necklace and it scraping across the skin. The most important thing that the post-mortem brought out in itself was that there was no natural cause for her to die. No natural cause for Miss Hings to be dead. In addition, there was some quite disturbing bruising around her jawline, around her mouth, something that really makes you think we have to be sure that this woman hasn't been strangled or smothered.
Less than 24 hours after Jane was discovered, the fast turnaround DNA profile from the tongue bar is returned from the lab.
That profile was put into the DNA database, and they soon had a match. They had a hit, and that match was Craig Kehoe.
26-year-old Craig Kehoe's DNA was on file, as he was known to the local police as a petty criminal. Now, he was part of a major manhunt.
Craig Kehoe was a local lad. He grew up in the area. He still lived in the area. Craig led a transient lifestyle. He doesn't have a car, he didn't have a phone, he didn't have a job, he didn't claim benefits. So trying to work out where he lived in the Fleckney area meant we had to do a lot of inquiries at a fast pace, but in a discreet way as well.
Police managed to trace Craig to a caravan which was on the outskirts of Fleckney, but not very far from where Jane lived.
Once we'd identified that he was living in a caravan, we sent officers there.
Someone in the caravan! Police! Open the door! Police, open the door! Someone with the dark hair in there.
And there was a slight standoff of about 30 seconds where the caravan was surrounded and Craig took some time coming to the door before he's arrested.
Right, hands behind back.
Right, at this moment in time, I'm arresting on suspicion of murder. The rest is necessary for prompt and effective investigation. You don't have to say anything. May harm to face, do not mention one question. Something which later will lie in the court. Anything you do say may be given in evidence. Do you understand everything I've said to you?
Craig is taken into custody as detectives try to build a picture of the young man they suspect murdered Jane.
He didn't live far from Jane. He was a former factory worker. He'd been in trouble for burglary, a few break-ins and stealing from his parents and from a friend. But he wasn't known as a major criminal. He wasn't known for anything as horrific as this.
As Craig's DNA was identified on the tongue bar and in her bungalow, detectives want to know how it got there. Craig is interviewed under caution.
When was the last time you saw her then?
The last time I saw her was Sunday night.
Okay. What time would that have been?
I got there for about 10:30.
You got there at 10:30?
Yeah.
That's PM?
About 10:30 at night.
At night? Okay. So if we take from 10:30 at night then, through to when you left at 11,
yeah.
Tell me exactly in detail what happened.
Well, I was watching a little film on the TV, and then she asked me to have sex with her at the end.
Just tell me exactly what she said to you about having sex.
She just said, Craig, will you have sex with me? And then, well, the first time it started off was about a month ago, and I was in the house, and then she just came into the front room naked, and then she was like, Craig, come and do it with me and I'll pay you.
He offered the reason that his DNA was inside of Jane and inside the scene was because Jane had paid him for sex.
Okay, and how much did she pay you?
Yeah, she paid me £200.
£200?
In the village of Fleckney in Leicestershire, police have arrested 25-year-old Craig Kehoe on suspicion of the murder of Jane Hings.
Do not have to say anything. May harm to face, do not mention one question. Something which later will lie in the court. Anything you do say may be given in evidence. Do you understand everything I've said to you?
Could this local lad really be responsible for the rape and murder of a 72-year-old pensioner? The news has sent shockwaves through the tight-knit community.
How could somebody that I'd grown up with all these years could be physically capable of doing something like that? I felt sick and it was horrible. Like, who does think something like that to such you know what I mean? You hear about it, but she was an old lady. She was old. He was a young lad.
Keogh has been taken into custody and is being interviewed under caution. With his DNA found on the victim and at the scene, detectives want to know how Craig knows Jane, and he has an explanation.
I was walking through the village, and I saw this lady, and her shopping bag broke, and I helped her, and then I carried it to the house with her.
Craig told us in an interview that he met Jane when he was down the shops, and that she asked him to pick up some shopping for him and offered him some money for it, and then asked him to walk her dog, Paddy, as well.
But Craig alleges that it wasn't just household chores Jane was paying him for.
And then another time, she's asked me to have sex with her for money. And it happened a month ago, the first time. And then she's asked me to come back a month later, and then it happened again.
Key to the police investigation was the tongue piercing found in Jane's groin.
Have you got any piercings?
I got my ear pierced.
Your ear pierced? Okay. Anywhere else?
Yeah, my tongue pierced.
Your tongue?
Craig goes on to admit that he'd been with Jane the night she died, saying he arrived at her house around 10:30 p.m.
Tell me exactly in detail what happened.
Well, we were watching a little film on the TV, and then she asked me to have sex with her again, and she was like, "I'll pay you more this time." I was like, "Okay." I didn't think anything of it, and that was it really. And she said she felt sick, and then I left her.
Craig's detailed account that he had sex with Jane and left her very much alive turns the investigation on its head.
During the course of his interviews, he came up with an explanation as to what happened. And I have to say, it was so bizarre.
Craig also suggested that Jane, whilst alive, was unwell when he left.
What he was saying was that she'd become a little bit wobbly and a little bit unwell, and had then gone back to her bed. He'd then closed the door, and obviously whatever happened afterwards was someone else. Some stranger, no doubt having seen that the door was open, would have gone in there, burgled her, and perhaps killed her. And so that might possibly have been an explanation for what happened.
The interviewing officers had to keep an open mind, but had to probe and get as much detail from him as possible to find out whether it was right or not.
Was Craig telling the truth? Was Jane alive when he left? And so was it someone else who sexually assaulted and killed her? Forensics carry out a detailed search for additional DNA or fingerprints on Jane or in the bungalow.
There was nothing else from the scene, from Jane, from the post-mortem which identified anybody else other than Craig. We'd had all of these things examined, and they only pointed at Craig Keogh and did not point to anybody else.
With no one else in the frame, Craig's movements on the night in question are investigated.
Craig had been on a night out in Oadby, a nearby town.
I think it was between 8:30 he came in that night. Remember it well because Leicester City had played Liverpool on that night, so we had a fair few in. He stood out straight away because he had his baseball cap the other way around, and he was just bouncing up and down.
Staff at the pub said that he appeared agitated, aggressive, and almost as if he was up for a fight. They said he was high on drink and drugs.
Now, this was crucially important evidence because in his interviews, he'd said that by 10:30 that evening, he was sitting in Jane Hing's living room in Fleckney, watching a war film and having a drink with her. That was a lie. He was out with his friends. We were able, by that process, to show that he'd taken cocaine, that he was offering to sell other people cocaine, and that he was complaining about how boring the evening was.
As doubt is cast on Keogh's version of events, police trace his movements after he leaves the pub. He's next seen arriving back in Fleckney at just after 1 a.m.
His friends say that the last time they saw him was when the taxi dropped him off, and they assumed he was going home.
But Keogh walks in the opposite direction of his caravan, heading in the direction of Jane's bungalow.
We knew from CCTV that the suspect had walked to Jane's house wearing a baseball cap, and when they were walking away, they didn't have it on, and we could see that.
Detectives believe this places Keogh in Jane's bungalow around 1:15 a.m. And when he returns home, he's captured again.
We see him going back into his caravan, carrying something. Now, he goes out again, and he returns out around 2:30 in the morning for another 15 minutes or so, and we are certain that he went back to Jane Hing's house in that period of time. We don't know what he did.
The following morning, Craig is again seen on camera.
The morning after he was seen walking along the street, he was captured on CCTV with a black bin bag.
He's spotted again a few minutes later, but the bag has vanished. What did he dispose of? The police believe it was some of Jane's belongings, but a search of the area reveals nothing.
This is HFM.
It's 5 o'clock. This is HFM News. Detectives have been given more time to continue questioning a man on suspicion of murder following the discovery of a pensioner dead in her bungalow in Fleckney on Sunday morning. Officers also believe items were stolen from Miss Hings's bungalow in a black bin liner. They're appealing for villagers to check their gardens and outbuildings in case it's been discarded there. A post-mortem examination has so far failed to identify her cause of death.
With help from the public and CCTV, police are able to piece together Keogh's movements 24 hours after Jane's death. Friends described Craig as splashing his cash, buying them drinks and himself a new tongue bar.
He tried to get rid of Jane's jewellery in trying to sell it. He got rid of her handbag. He was trying to get rid of every last bit of evidence that would connect him to Jane.
He went into Leicester city centre and he actually went to a pawnbroker's. He sold her jewellery for about £100 when the items of jewellery were valued around £1,000.
With enough evidence that Keogh stole items from Jane and had raped her, detectives also believe they have a killer on their hands. But proving he murdered Jane was going to be their biggest challenge.
So far as murder was concerned, we had no cause of death. We were unable to show how she died, whether it was deliberate or accidental, forensically at that stage.
In the village of Fleckney, 25-year-old Craig Keogh has been charged with burglary, murder, and the rape of pensioner Jane Hings. The news that Jane was sexually assaulted in her home has been made public.
The community were on edge already, knowing that an old lady had been murdered in her home, but then once the true nature of it came out, people were really worried.
When I found out that information, it just floored me. It played on my mind all night. You know, a woman of that age, how, why could that happen?
I'd say the villagers would be distressed because a majority of them are similar sort of age to Miss Hinks. And you know, and there's quite a few vulnerable people out there as well, and it obviously upset them, but also put a bit of fear into them as well, that this could happen on their doorstep.
Within days of his arrest, Keogh is brought before a judge and the charges read.
He pleaded not guilty to all the charges, so that was murder, 2 counts of rape and burglary.
Keogh is remanded in custody and a date set for his trial. But the work of the prosecution is only just beginning.
This was horrific violence perpetrated on a very frail old lady whilst she was still alive. And there was then the added complication of trying to prove how she died.
So one of Craig Keogh's lines of defence actually referred to him knowing Jane Hings, and yeah, he said that she paid him for sex, and that was a reason that he went around and he claimed she was still alive when he left her bungalow on that night.
Experts believe that Jane has been smothered with a pillow, and proving it was Keogh is imperative to the case.
The DNA on the pillows was of saliva, and so we could show that Jane's saliva was on the pillows. That was all.
Typically with a material object, you can't get fingerprints from it. And it's really difficult. For us as investigators, we sat there believing that the pillowcases were our murder weapon. How could we prove that?
With concern that Keogh might get away on a technicality, the police and prosecution reach out to forensic specialists.
Now, our pillowcases had been sat in the bottom of an evidence bag, sat in the exhibit store for, at this point, 4 months. They weren't laid out flats like you'd see in a movie or anything like this. This is a pillowcase shoved in the bottom of an evidence bag.
But as we got nearer to trial, we discovered a new scientific development.
Leicestershire Police said to me they had a pillowcase that they were interested in trying to develop some fingerprints on. They wanted to know whether a novel process I'd been researching was appropriate for this type of exhibit. I recommended that they tried vacuum metal deposition, and I also directed them towards Gloucestershire Police, who had a vacuum metal deposition machine that they could use and a trained operator, which is probably the best technique that we're aware of that gives you a chance of getting fingerprints on fabrics.
Vacuum metal deposition involves vaporizing gold and zinc in a vacuum chamber. The metallic particles are attracted to the fabric and form a negative image of finger marks wherever it has been touched.
So what you have here is the image of the pillowcase as it's come out of the vacuum metal deposition machine. These dark regions where you have quite a lot of zinc deposition, and you have these light regions where zinc simply hasn't deposited. It shows whereabouts the pillowcase has been gripped, and it also enables you to say, well, it's been touched there, so you can then target other techniques such as DNA recovery for those techniques.
We were able, therefore, to show that the pillow had been held in a position that you wouldn't hold a pillow ordinarily in order to put it over Jane Hings' head to kill her.
So that proved our murder weapon. We had Keogh's finger marks on the short edge and Jane's saliva in the middle of the pillow.
But the question is, would it be enough to convict Keogh? The trial begins at Birmingham Crown Court, and Jane's friends come face to face with Keogh.
Craig was just deadpan through the whole entire time. Not an ounce of remorse, not any kind of emotion. He showed nothing.
When Craig sat in the dock, he was expressionless. It was difficult to really see any signs of emotion.
Obviously, Jane's friends are of her age, so are a lot older and didn't want to go and sit through all of that. So I went and sat for her. I didn't want Craig to think that nobody cared about her. I wanted to be seen that, you know, she meant something to somebody.
Craig had denied all along that he was responsible for raping and murdering Jane Hings. In fact, his version of events was at complete odds with the prosecution's case, the police case. He had said that he had gone to see Jane to have sex. He said that they had watched a film together that night, a war film. Checks were made, and there was no war film on TV. It was a complete and utter lie.
As the trial unfolds, the defence tried to paint a picture of Jane.
Craig Keogh was describing Jane Hings as being a sexually promiscuous, drunken woman who liked nothing more than spending her pension money on having intercourse with a young man. We discovered she didn't drink alcohol. There was no alcohol in her bloodstream after her death.
So the jury were then shown all the mobility aids that Jane had in the house, the fact that she couldn't walk between rooms without needing a walking stick or a frame.
So the idea of her being interested in active sexual activity was laughable.
Central to the prosecution case is proving that the sexual contact was non-consensual.
So we instructed an expert in sexual injuries to examine her body. And as a result of that, we were able to show that the sexual activity was not consensual activity, and it would have caused her significant amounts of pain, and it happened when she was alive.
And it was for this reason they believe Keogh decided to kill Jane.
She must have cried out when that happened, and he must have wanted not to be caught and to complete the act. And we know he did complete the act because there was semen within her body. And I expect that during the course of that sexual assault upon her, he decided to kill her because she wouldn't shut up.
Establishing that Keogh had the motive and opportunity to kill Jane, the prosecution introduces what they believe is the murder weapon.
The scientists went the extra mile on this one because they could show that finger marks left by Keogh were on the short, straight edges at the side, and they were gripped like this and applied. And they then took it one step further to look for the amylase staining, that's the protein staining in the middle, to show that Jane had exhaled a lot and given out a lot of moisture from her breath, indicating that that's where she was smothered. And then when the scientists came to court to explain it, the jury was sat there like, oh wow, this is really impactful.
With the prosecution evidence built against him, Keogh remained silent.
Craig sat there very quiet. He chose not to give evidence. He chose not to be cross-examined by prosecutor, and he showed no remorse, even when the horrific details were read out of what he had done.
Craig Keogh could not offer any evidence which the jury could look at and say that he was not guilty. He couldn't offer any alibi, and he couldn't offer any plausible explanation as to why this had happened or why he was suspected of it.
After 5 days, the jury is sent to deliberate. Presented with all the evidence, they have to decide whether the marks at the edge of the pillow and all the new scientific data prove that the young man in front of them is a murderer.
There are two choices for a jury here. Either he went into that house and raped her and burgled the property and then left, and a random stranger came in and smothered her, or the person who raped her smothered her. That's the choice.
Even though you've listened to the whole trial and you know he's guilty, the evidence says he's guilty, those minutes, hours of waiting to hear them words, it's still nerve-wracking, you know, because they could come back with not guilty.
After 4 hours, the jury returns.
They came back and unanimously said that he was guilty of 2 counts of rape, murder and burglary.
When the jury came back, he was plainly shocked. Craig Keogh stood there. And when sentence was imposed, he stood there with an element of resignation, but he didn't seem at any stage to show any kind of remorse. No sadness for her, no sadness for his own family, who appeared to be very decent people. From the beginning to the end, it seemed to me he was entirely focused on himself.
Keogh was given a life sentence and will only be eligible for parole after 32 years. But for all involved, this case has taken its toll.
When I went into Jane Hing's house, I was struck by the peace and tranquility in which she'd lived her life. She was a very simple lady. Beside her bed on one side was her Bible and a crucifix. And on the other side, as she had gone to bed, no doubt like every other night, she'd left her teeth on the side of the bed. And imagining just being in your own bedroom, in the comfort of your own home, and having a young, strong man, plainly intoxicated and under the influence of drunks, coming into your room about 1:15 in the morning, waking you from your sleep, must have been terrifying. That, I think, stays with me.
This case will stick with me. It's one that the community will remember for a long time. It's one that the police officers who went to will remember for a long time.
I've covered numerous murder trials over the last 25 years. The rape of anyone is distressing, it's shocking, but this was particularly shocking because it involved the rape of an elderly woman.
I've been asked many times, what are my feelings towards Craig? And I have none, is the simple answer. I don't hate him because that's an emotion. I literally have no emotion towards him. But to think of what he did, it broke my heart to try and think about the fear that would have been going through her mind at the time. And then to be smothered with her own pillow. Jane was cremated and I put her ashes in an urn that sits on my mantelpiece so she can watch over Paddy every day until the day that he sadly joins her, in which case I will get him cremated and scatter their ashes someplace nice. Are you gorgeous? So they can be together again.
Stranger danger is rare but not impossible. The chilling Murdered at First Sight is new Wednesday at 9 on Sky Mix.
The news broke overnight.
It was brutal, you know, and it was in an area where you don't expect these sorts of things to happen.
The principal injuries were to her head. There were signs of multiple blows from a heavy object.
This is a sustained, violent assault.
Such a quiet, beautiful village. The fact that there was a murderer on the loose was really scary for people.
4,500 occupants of local homes in the area were questioned. She was well known, well liked, well loved. Very difficult to imagine anyone would target her.
As far as picture-perfect villages go, Bosham in West Sussex is up there with the best of them.
Bosham is a really picturesque, beautiful village. A lot of people from London have their second houses down here, so there's a lot of money down here as well.
It's predominantly a sailing village. A lot of sailing goes on in Bosham. People come from quite a way locally to go sailing in Bosham.
As a quaint coastal town, Bosham attracts its fair share of visitors.
A lot busier in the summer. Loads and loads of people come around to visit the area. But in this area, in the heart of the village, if you like, it's a pretty close-knit community, and people look out for each other, and it's just, it's just quite a typical sort of English village, I'd say.
The demographic is mainly of an elderly nature. There is the Chichester Harbour, which is an area of outstanding natural beauty, where a lot of the locals would go to sail, take lovely strolls and walks along the harbour. Especially in the summer months, it's more attractive for the tourists because of the lovely weather we get here in the south coast.
Crime is so low in Bosham, there are often months with nothing reported.
I remember being told by the police there hadn't been a crime recorded in Bosham for 6 months. So not a robbery, nothing, not a car broken into.
But in a village where everyone knows everyone, when the unthinkable happens, it tears a community apart.
Police are investigating after the body of a woman was found dead in a multi-million-pound property in a Hampshire village. The death is currently being treated as suspicious.
The news broke overnight that a woman was found in a home in Bosham.
The first that I knew that something had happened, there were multiple police cars and ambulances, which in Bosham it's unusual even to see one police car from week to week around the village, so that we obviously knew that something had happened, something had gone on.
At 10 a.m, 5 days after Christmas, Sussex police receive a 999 call to a large rural property in the village.
Police emergency, how can I help you?
The distraught caller reveals there's a woman dead in bed.
Obviously, the paramedics and police were called and they responded. They found the female in bed with clearly significant head injuries where she'd been struck numerous times with a blunt instrument.
The details from the police came in that the lady who had been found had been bludgeoned to death with an object. Her face was smashed in.
And it was clear at that point that this was a murder investigation.
It is quickly established the deceased woman is not the owner of the sumptuous property, as they are away for Christmas. So who is the woman? And who would want her dead?
There was a little bit of panic in the village because this sort of thing doesn't happen in Bosham.
It's such a quiet, beautiful village that the fact that there was a murderer on the loose was really scary for people.
Suddenly there was all this activity going on, lots and lots of police cars and everything. And of course, within no time, everybody knew there had been a murder. And there was a lot of gossiping and guesswork and so on.
As a journalist for the local newspaper at the time, Kelly Wickham was more used to reporting on village fates, but now found herself at the centre of a murder investigation.
Rumours started emerging about who could possibly have committed such a crime in this area. There were many speculations that came about, such as, why was the victim there? She didn't own the property. Where was the property owner?
A woman murdered while house-sitting a property in a seaside village has been named as Valerie Graves. Sussex police said that a post-mortem examination had not yet been carried out, but the woman is believed to have died of head injuries.
She just turned 55 on Christmas Day 2013, 4 days before her death. She originally was from London, had moved to Scotland to set up her home and a business up there, but returned down south to look after her elderly mother Eileen and spend more time with her family. She had 2 children, 2 grandchildren.
She had lived in Scotland for about 10 years and she was a local artist up there.
Police soon established that Valerie was looking after the house over the festive period with her mum, her sister, and her sister's partner.
Things I would be considering en route to that particular crime scene would be who did find Valerie and under what circumstances? Who was the last person to see Valerie alive? Was there any sign of any struggle, any sign of any forced entry? If there's no sign of forced entry, then you may start thinking, well, was the premises insecure, or is this something that's occurred inside the family home? So was there a dispute that had taken place? So until you've kind of spoken to the family, you can't rule them out, but you can't rule them in as well.
With the identity of their victim now known, police need to establish who would want her dead. Investigators immediately look at the hours leading up to the discovery of her body.
The night of the 29th of December was rather like any other. Normal watching of television. In fact, it was 10 p.m. that Mrs. Graves took her iPad and a book to bed. She was the first to go to bed. She was staying on the ground floor at the back of the house.
We understand in the morning her sister woke up with her partner. Her partner decided to go down to the farm shop to get some breakfast goods. Noticed that the bedroom door was slightly ajar, didn't think anything of it. He went out to the shops. Her sister then went in to check on Valerie and sadly found her clearly deceased in bed.
There were many rumours circulating about why did nobody hear her scream? Was this an inside job? Was there somebody in the house perhaps that knew what had happened? It was a really strange time because a lot of fingers were being pointed in a lot of directions.
Certainly at the beginning, you have to keep a very open mind in relation to what may have happened. And unfortunately, that involves including, were family members involved in this? And so you have to sort of hold them at arm's length to a certain extent, ask them a number of questions in relation to their movements.
Intense questioning of Valerie's family begins.
I do remember conversations about the fact that the family hadn't heard anything upstairs and she was downstairs, and a lot of people were like, well, how did they not hear anything? Was it something to do with the family? Was there more to it than that? It was, obviously people were speculating.
Initial reports into her death reveal a brutal attack.
The injuries to Mrs. Graves were akin to a high-speed, head-on collision.
So how could no one in the house have heard anything?
You have that gut feeling. You sense when you're speaking to people, looking at them in the eye, as to whether or not you think they are involved. And obviously, it'll be a very traumatic scene for the family there, and very unlikely that you're going to get crocodile tears under those circumstances. And again, you want to know what sort of relationship the family have with Valerie and why would they want to do that. So I think, whilst you can't rule them out straight away, you get a quick sense of whether or not they're involved.
Speculation and theories about the motive escalate. But as the family is ruled out, suspicion falls on the local villagers.
There was always a slight fear in the back of your mind that it could be someone that you knew in the village and that they might still be on the loose.
The feeling everywhere seemed to be that of panic, worry, apprehension. Nobody could quite believe that somebody could be murdered, especially while sleeping in their own bed over the Christmas period. People just felt unsafe, really. Would this person attack again? Who was next?
In the pretty coastal village of Bosham, news is spreading that artist Valerie Graves has been brutally murdered while house-sitting over Christmas.
I work for some elderly clients that live in Bosham Home, and they were absolutely petrified because they're both in their 80s. The realisation that there's obviously a murderer out there, that the lady had been murdered in her sleep and they didn't know why.
When the details did come out and you realise the sort of the gravity and the viciousness of the attack, it was quite worrying at the time. For a few months, everyone was sort of watching themselves or looking over their shoulders a little bit, thinking, could it be him, could it be her?
With a murder investigation underway, police need to consider who would want to harm Valerie. Due to tides and flooding in the village at that time of year, Police believe it's unlikely to have been an opportunist burglar, meaning one thing: the killer has to be local.
The weather was particularly miserable, lots of local floods going on, and it's not the sort of area that passing traffic would go through. You have to sort of go out of your way to get into Bosham. And so I would imagine over that period it was almost a kind of a lockdown in that area where the locals would just stay there and no one would come to visit unless it was to visit family and friends.
The area was pretty flooded. Not many visitors would have come to the area at this time of the year. It's Christmas. People would be spending time with their families together. And there was no real need for visitors, so the speculation was it must have been somebody local.
With the community the centre of a major investigation, everyone is a suspect.
The police came knocking on everybody's doors, and literally everybody. I mean, they came with a tool, and they would interview each member of the family separately.
Police have several avenues in which to explore.
You'd also want to know who else has access to that address. So we know that the occupiers are away on holiday. A few phone calls could easily establish where they are and whether they had opportunity to get back to the address. But you're also thinking, well, who would do this and why would they do this? You know, Valerie was 55 years of age, she was in bed, she posed no threat to anyone. And so why would somebody do this? And you then start thinking about who lives in the area that could possibly have the motive to do this.
Having ruled out Valerie's family and the owners of the house, who were abroad, Valerie's body is taken for a post-mortem examination. Could this lead provide clues as to the cause of death and the sort of person who would commit such an atrocious crime?
The thing that all post-mortems are looking for is a medical cause of death. Physically, why is this person dead? But the forensic post-mortem also looks at, in more detail, the injuries present, patterns of injury, what the likely implement that may have caused them was, when they may have occurred, and really trying to get a much more clear narrative of the events surrounding this person's death. The expertise is in what sort of weapon was it, how much force was used, have they defended themselves.
The principal injuries were to her head. I'm looking at the pathology report now. There was extreme complexity to the wounds, signs of multiple blows from a heavy object, impossible for the pathologist to determine just how many blows.
It's a physical effort to strike someone multiple times with sufficient force to damage them. It is not an easy task, and it is not something that can be achieved in a second or two. This is a sustained, violent assault.
The injuries that not only cause laceration of the skin, but also complete disruption of the central facial skeleton of the jaw, together with depressed fractures of the skull, with extending fractures to the base of the skull. And there was a patterned injury to the left side of the forehead, showing a semicircle, which, in the pathologist's opinion, would be consistent with the application of force from the round end of a hammer.
If somebody has died as a result of multiple blows with a hammer to the head, it will be clear from the size and shape of the injuries that that is what occurred. The normal head of the hammer is going to leave round to oval lacerations and abrasions when it strikes the body.
Having discovered Valerie was battered to death with a hammer, tragically the post-mortem reveals how she tried to fight off her attacker.
There's a level of defensive injuries sustained to Mrs. Graves. Her left hand, she must have raised above her head to shield her head from the blows, revealed extensive bruising to the back of her hand, together with fractures of 2 of the bones of that hand.
Police still cannot believe no one in the house heard the attack, but now they have a new focus. Could the hammer reveal clues as to the perpetrator? And does the killer still have it?
You then have a cursory search around the premises to make sure that the weapon hasn't been left by the offender, because that could yield some forensic opportunities. And then you work your way into the grounds of the premises and bring in sufficient officers to conduct that search, which will include lifting up drains, looking at people's bins, going through people's gardens, and then just increasing out from the crime scene itself in case the offender has taken the weapon with them and then discarded it en route back to wherever they come from.
With the pressure on to find a hammer-wielding killer, local tradespeople are under the spotlight.
When I got interviewed by the police, it's because I was working for my elderly clients, so they'd obviously lived in the area, and I worked for them, so they were interviewing everybody that was in the local vicinity. So, you know, they wanted to know exactly what make of hammer that I had in the van, and yeah, it was quite worrying.
And it isn't long before their hunch pays off and police make an announcement.
A man has been arrested on suspicion of the murder of an artist who was found dead at a property she was house-sitting over the Christmas period.
He lived very close to the scene of the crime, together with the fact that his occupation was manual, he was a labourer, may well have led the police to arrest him.
With a man being questioned, police continue to build their case and look for evidence.
They'll also be doing other forensic examinations within the crime scene, so there will be a number of fingerprints, for example, that may turn up within the house that are alien to that address. But it could be a window cleaner, it could be somebody who's done work in that address previously. And so these inquiries need to be bottomed out. And sometimes if you get a fingerprint of an individual together with an account that cannot be corroborated and they're not alibied, then that will give sufficient grounds for the police to arrest that individual and put further questions to them under caution.
The arrested man is interviewed extensively by police.
Despite the fact he spent some time in police custody, he was fully exonerated.
Police are back to square one. But then a discovery is made.
A weapon was found about 600 metres away from the home. It was that of a red claw hammer.
The finding of the hammer was absolutely crucial. It had the blood of Mrs. Graves on it, and therefore was the murder weapon.
And the hammer itself had been exposed to the elements for a couple of days, which means the opportunity to yield forensic evidence is reducing daily. But that said, the scientists were able to yield a DNA profile confirming Valerie's DNA. And then what the scientists also found was a very small partial DNA, and all they could say was that it related to a male individual.
Police now believe for certain Valerie's killer was male. Who is he? And why would he want Valerie dead? Investigations ramp up a notch and the search for the owner of the hammer begins.
The hammer was a 16-ounce forged steel claw hammer, the sort of hammer you'd find from any DIY store. But to show the depth of the police investigation, they contacted Screwfix, who are the company who manufactured this hammer, and then trawled through the records of those suppliers who had sold this type of hammer and then tried to eliminate purchasers from their inquiries.
The risks around having a partial profile is obviously you don't know who it belongs to, and actually it could be an innocent profile. So it could have been, the shopkeeper that sold that hammer. It could be their profile. It could be somebody who's borrowed that hammer. So it may not necessarily link to the murderer, but at least it gives you an idea as to who you want to speak to that may have had contact with that hammer, and then that can then lead on to further inquiries.
With a partial DNA profile on the hammer, every male in the surrounding area is suddenly the focus of police attention.
The next step then is to start looking at males within the area, matching a certain criteria, who they're then going to ask to come forward and voluntarily give their DNA. It's a very expensive and time-consuming process.
Everybody was asked to come and volunteer, including people such as the postman, people that live nearby, anybody in the area.
They set up a mass DNA screening process where they asked local men from the age of 17 and upwards to come to a location, bring their ID with them, give them a thumbprint, and then offer a DNA sample that can then be checked against the partial male DNA profile that the police already had, so that they could either be ruled in or ruled out of that investigation.
So the response locally was outstanding because there was a joint desire in this small village town of Bosham that they wanted a culprit caught, not just, of course, for Mrs. Graves and her friends and family, but because they had, on the face of it, a very dangerous man out loose.
There was DNA testing stations set up around the village. Myself and a few friends, and there's loads of us all went to, everyone that I know of went and got tested. I don't think anyone refused or didn't go. I think it was the sort of thing that actually, do you know what, if you haven't got anything to hide, then you've got no problem going and doing a DNA test.
Months of DNA screening takes place in Bosham and the surrounding villages.
So the police will do all they can to try and detect this crime. They need to do this for the family, but also to reassure the community that there isn't somebody dangerous still out and about. So they'll be undertaking all sorts of inquiries. The forensic searches alone will take, many weeks, if not months. And then with those samples will take many more months to then try and establish whether any DNA can be taken from those samples.
But as time ticks away, the hunt for Valerie's killer goes cold.
The police were at a loss. There were no new leads. Nobody had come forward with any more information.
5 years after her murder, Valerie's family, the police, and the villagers of Bosham are left fearing her killer will never be found.
So they were mystified, absolutely mystified. Who could have wanted this lady harm?
It's 5 years since the murder of Valerie Graves in the quaint coastal resort of Bosham in West Sussex, and police are no nearer to a suspect or a motive.
At first, we thought there might be a quick outcome to solving the crime, because it's quite a heinous crime, but there was nothing at all for weeks and then months and then ultimately years.
Having found a partial DNA profile of a male on a hammer believed to be the murder weapon, police have spread their net around the surrounding villages in the hunt for a suspect.
It led to thousands of hours of police work. 4,500 occupants of local homes in the area were questioned. 600 statements were taken. 3,059 males were eliminated by large-scale DNA screening.
In December 2018, I had a statement from the police renewing their appeal to find Valerie's murderer 5 years on. It was a really good statement. They were offering a substantial reward for any information at all. So for me, this was my front page story for that week. It was Christmas, it was a quiet news week anyway, and this was a real heartfelt story that I felt people needed to read about, even at this time. It might just jog someone's memory, it might just nudge them to remembering something that perhaps they felt was insignificant, but that would help police lead to an arrest at last and help the family put this to bed at last.
The police can't solve this on their own. They do need the assistance of the community, and quite often they will use the media to support them with that. Sadly, at times we have to offer a financial incentive for people to come forward, so it's not unusual for a reward to be put up for information that would lead to the arrest and prosecution of the offender. But you hope in cases like this that really do trouble the community that, you know, somebody, if they had information, they would come forward and they wouldn't be motivated by money.
With no clues as to who killed Valerie, police take a step back. and re-examine the moments leading to her death. The attack had been so ferocious, so how had no one in the house heard a thing?
So this was a large house. Her sister and her mother and her sister's partner were sleeping in bedrooms upstairs. Valerie was sleeping downstairs in a ground floor bedroom where there were patio doors that then led on to the back garden. At that point, we know that somebody then entered those patio doors and then sadly, brutally murdered her with a blunt instrument.
Police dig a little deeper into their victim.
The profile of Valerie Graves did surprise us all as a victim. She was just an ordinary person, for as far as we know, had no reason to be murdered in such a way or at all.
Valerie had spent a few days looking after the sumptuous property off Smugglers Lane with her sister, sister's partner, and her mum. And December 29th, 2013 was a quiet night in.
We know that Valerie and her family were in the house. They pretty much stayed in that evening to watch TV, as most families do. I think they were probably getting tired of the Christmas period. You know, Christmas had followed, birthday celebration had taken place, and it was a normal evening. So they'd all watched TV, and then by about 10 o'clock that evening, they all put themselves to bed.
Mrs. Graves was found by her sister the following morning. Initially, she thought that her sister was sleeping in. She shouted out, her door was slightly ajar, the door to her bedroom, and there was no response. She thought perhaps she was lying in. And it was only later when she went in through that door, she saw Mrs. Graves' legs sticking out under the duvet and realised that she was cold. And in panic, of course, naturally, she then rang the police.
Was this a planned murder? Had Valerie been targeted?
For me, there would be a number of hypotheses. The first one is that this is possibly a family member. You know, there'd been a dispute that evening and things have got out of hand and, you know, and unfortunately, Valerie's been assaulted. Another hypothesis is that she was targeted, but you then think, well, who would know she was there? This isn't her home address, so is she under surveillance by somebody? Is there a relationship that's gone wrong in the past that somebody is looking to assault and injure Valerie?
Well, the police found it extremely difficult to ascertain why someone would attack Mrs. Graves. She was well-known, well-liked, well-loved, and they found it very difficult to imagine anyone would target her.
Police had already ruled out Valerie's distraught family and find nothing in her background which could suggest someone holds a grudge against her.
They thought, perhaps naturally, that it was a case of mistaken identity, an attacker wanting to seek vengeance on someone for some reason.
The people that owned the house, there were all sorts of rumours that went round about them and hitmen and all sorts of silly rumours.
Rumours even spread that the house had been advertised on a site for swingers wanting sex parties and that the family had been there at the wrong time.
There was a lot of wild rumour and speculation at the time. Some of it completely untrue, some of it perhaps a little bit more close to the truth.
But with no real clues coming forward, police home in on one explanation.
Some of these villages, people are of the mindset they don't have to lock their doors, whereas if you live in a city centre, you're probably more likely to do that. Was this an opportunist burglar who just happened to be in the area? Again, unlikely, I would have thought, because it's such a remote location, and therefore, was it a burglar who knew exactly what they were going for? Because they knew that the occupants were away.
Police now believe Valerie's murder was the result of a burglary gone wrong, and that the burglar knew the owners were due to be away. But even that theory throws up questions.
What seemed rather peculiar was that if it was a burglary, why was nothing taken? Seems rather a lot of effort and savagery, for want of a better word, to then leave empty-handed. So they were mystified, absolutely mystified.
having already tested thousands of locals for their DNA and come up blank. And despite offering a reward for information leading to an arrest, police are still no closer to a suspect. And then, everything changes.
On the 10th of July 2019, Cristian Sabu was arrested at his home address in Romania. He was asked whether he'd killed Valerie Graves.
But who is Cristian Sabu? And what would he know about such a brutal and bloody murder all those years ago? Five and a half years after the brutal murder of grandmother Valerie Graves in the village of Bosham, West Sussex, there's been a development.
The police got in touch with us in July 2019 to let us know that an arrest had been made for Valerie's murder. This came as a huge shock to everybody. It seemed to come out of nowhere at all.
Hearing the name Valerie Graves come up again in the news was quite a shock, and yeah, hearing that they'd made an arrest.
The man is 28-year-old Cristian Sabu. But what had led to an arrest of a man in Romania so long after the murder?
Years had passed since the brutal murder of Valerie, and the police finally had a breakthrough in that they had been contacted by email by a lady in Transylvania, in Romania, indicating that her husband was responsible for the murder.
But who is he? Did he kill Valerie, and why?
What the police have managed to establish is back in 2013, Cristian Sabu had moved from Romania over to England and was living in a caravan on the A27 in West Sussex, very close to Bosham. Some suggestion he was looking for work, may have done a bit of scrap metal dealing, but also some local odd jobs as well in the area.
Cristian Sabu left the UK and went back to Romania. That is where he lived with his partner, had a child, lived a normal, as it turns out, law-abiding life.
But 5 years later, Cristian Sabu's partner and mother of his 2 children tips off police that her husband is the killer.
When the police receive information like this, you have to be very cautious in the first instance. You have to question what the motive is for this female to come forward and say that Cristian Sabu was responsible for the murder. I understand they were going through some matrimonial difficulties at that time. So, you know, was her motive to try and, get him into trouble when perhaps he may have been an innocent person?
His wife had seen on Google that he'd been searching about the murder.
He'd been checking out the reporting of the Valerie Graves murder in Bosham back in 2013. And at that time, her and her husband were living just down the road on the A27 in West Sussex.
And she recognised the hammer that he'd been looking at. And she confronted him and asked him, isn't this the hammer that you had in England?
But reporting her suspicions to police is not enough to arrest Cristian Sabu for murder. They need irrefutable proof to secure a European arrest warrant to bring him back to the UK. Focus turns back to the hammer found discarded near the crime scene. Could this now hold the key to solving the case?
What the police did have was this partial male DNA profile, which could either implicate or eliminate Cristian Sabu very, very easily if we had his DNA.
But Cristian Sabu appears to have lived a crime-free life. His DNA is not on the UK or European police database, so they turned to his partner for help.
The police had to think long and hard as to how were they going to get a DNA sample from Cristian Sabu without alerting him, because if we do alert him, then, without arresting him, he could disappear and then we may never catch him. And so what they asked for through the Romanian police and Cristian Sabu's wife was to get DNA samples from his 2 children, which could then show a familial link to the partial DNA profile. And that's what they did.
And the results changed the course of the now cold murder investigation.
It came back as a likeliness that the partial DNA profile that they had found on the hammer was linked to Christian Sabu.
And then, of course, under a European arrest warrant, to bring Mr. Sabu, to his credit, without any fuss, he didn't object, he cooperated fully, and he was then brought to England.
I felt really sorry for his wife. Finding out this news must have been really horrific. This is someone that she's been married to for some time, she has children with. It must have been a real devastating blow to her. She must have feared for her own safety and for her children. I can't imagine what was going through her mind at the time. It must have been really horrible. And I imagine she was probably torn as well. This is the man that she's married to, that she no doubt loves. And she's probably in a really difficult situation.
On 19th July 2019, Christian Sabu is extradited to the UK.
The feeling in the village and the surrounding areas was just pure relief. People felt like, at last, this had been solved.
Sabu appears at Brighton Magistrates Court, charged with the murder of Valerie Graves.
Mr. Sabu presented as a thoroughly normal man. Uncomplicated. He was uncomplicated from the moment I met him. He was quiet. He wasn't a man of many words, though of course we had an interpreter. He still was not a man who spoke much. He was still, I thought, even with all the years, he was 22 at the time of the incident, 28 when I met him. He was still in shock. That was my belief about what had happened. He couldn't explain it to himself. And he was remorseful.
The man standing before court is at odds with the description of such a brutal killing.
He basically admitted the crime. He said that, he had little money, he was aware of the house, he knew that there were valuables inside that house, and more importantly, he knew that the owners were away over the Christmas period. So when he broke in, he was surprised to see Valerie, who confronted him. He had the hammer in his possession, and sadly, he then beat her with that hammer.
In November 2019, Christian Sabu takes the stand at Lewes Crown Court.
It was always the intention that he would be pleading guilty to the murder of Mrs. Graves.
He did say that he felt bad about it. He didn't mean to hurt her. He told the court how he had had something to drink, cycled to the property in the belief that the property was empty. He'd gone there to burgle the place, effectively, and he was shocked to find Valerie there. He said that he panicked, and that's when the attack took place. He said that he'd never meant to hurt her.
What remains perhaps a mystery to this day is why Mr. Sabu, on realising that there was someone in that room and in the house, simply didn't turn and leave. But he did strike her several times with extreme force. And I think only he will know what was going through his mind, but clearly full of panic. Alcohol, panic, stupidity.
Summing up the case, the judge accepted that Sabu had not intended to kill and sentenced him to 24 years in prison.
The judge on sentencing Christian Sabu said this: Mrs. Graves' head injuries were so severe that her maximum survival time would have been less than an hour. This was a sustained attack, and the terror and trauma for her in the final few minutes of her life is unimaginable. You had gone to those premises intending to burgle them, to steal from a safe you believed contained a lot of money. You took with you the hammer. You say you had been told the owners were away and therefore were unaware that Valerie, her mum, her sister and her sister's partner would all be in the house. It appears you entered the house via the patio doors in the room in which Mrs. Graves was sleeping. When you realised your mistake, namely that the room was occupied, rather than simply running away in the hope you couldn't be identified by a woman waking from sleep, you launched this horrific attack on Mrs. Graves, who had been asleep in that room. It was your dishonesty and greed that took you to the house. It was your cowardice and lack of morality that caused you to kill Valerie Graves.
7 years since the murder of Valerie Graves, the village of Bosham is slowly returning to normal. But the crime still lingers over them.
Although this had gone on for such a long time, it was in the forefront of a lot of people's minds. There was always that feeling of who did it. And I'm sure many of the men in the area perhaps felt they might have been looked at.
I mean, I was very glad that he got caught because it meant you can just go back to normal life. Whereas before, you do have this nickel in the background that somebody's murdered somebody from locally, because who else would go there? For a long time, we did think it must be somebody around here. I mean, who else could have done it?
I think the general feeling was one of relief that actually, you know, the chap had been found and the family could get some peace. Also that it wasn't someone in the village. I think that was, you know, even after all that time, I think that was still a bit of a relief that it wasn't a chap living up the road or, you know, someone you may know.
And the family of Valerie Graves can finally try to rebuild their lives.
We have had to endure 6 years of waiting, not knowing if anyone would ever be brought to justice for this cowardly act. Mum was very much loved by our family, but sorely missed by us all.
With as much drama in their personal lives as in their jobs, the FBI team have their work cut out. Join them Tuesday at 9, new to Sky Mix.
Please, how can I help? There was a 999 call received from dog walkers that had found a suitcase on a lay-by just near the road.
People came across a suitcase and opened it, and inside was the remains of a person.
Local people found it extraordinary that such an incident could happen here.
For a murder to happen, not only a murder, but a murder on this scale, it was absolutely shocking for the community.
We had knowledge that he had over £270,000 worth of debt, and he was struggling to pay off those debts.
There was blood absolutely everywhere in that room, on the sofa, on the walls and on the ceiling.
Through extreme measures, he used the alternative of planning the murder of his friend.
Tintwistle is an idyllic village nestled on the edge of the Peak District.
Tintwistle is a typical Peak District village. It's got a mixture of beautiful stone cottages. It's on the banks of the Longdendale Valley, and behind it are the Tintwistle Moors, known as the Nar and the Lower Moor. And it has stunning views over the Longdendale Valley and the 5 reservoirs.
A very parochial village where people can leave your back door open, no problems.
In Tintwistle, everyone knows each other. It's a very, neighbourly feel. It's a very close-knit community.
We've got a lot of people who have a lot of very good neighbours, and I think everybody supports each other.
In terms of crime rates in Tintwistle, it's fairly, non-existent.
But all this is about to change when the peace is shattered early one morning.
On the 10th of October, there was a 999 call received from dog walkers that had found a suitcase on a lay-by just near the road.
The location was on a main road that went between Manchester and Sheffield, and it dipped down a little bit into Derbyshire. It was a car park off the main road, but it was an area that was quite popular for walkers.
As you come into Tintwistle from the east, you go along what's called the Woodhead Pass, and this particular suitcase was dumped just over the wall as you go into the village beside the first reservoir.
As I remember, like this people passing by this lay-by and came across a suitcase and opened it, and inside the suitcase was the remains of a person.
Police are immediately dispatched to the area.
There's quite a long drive, really, from the point where I got the call to the point where I arrived at the scene. Just to give you some idea around the geography, when I first got the call, I was in Derby, which is here. The deposition site was all the way to the north of the county, to the north of Derbyshire, and as you can see, it's right at the very tip of the county.
Upon arrival, they are met with a gruesome sight.
It looks like the suitcase has been set on fire, and inside that suitcase we have a body of a man whose head has been removed, whose arms have been removed, and whose feet have been removed.
It was a Samsonite suitcase that was in an extremely charred state. But then it became apparent, and we had a human torso that had been extremely cruelly dismembered and burnt.
As a crime, this is really, really vicious. For somebody to remove all the limbs of a body, never mind commit the murder itself.
Derbyshire Constabulary launch a murder investigation, and news of the horrific find soon spreads around the village.
Oh, like chicken pox. Everybody talks about it, we all know about it. You go in the local shops. Have you heard?
In Tintwistle, it's a really neighbourly community. Everyone knows each other. If there's gossip, someone down the road will know about it in 10 minutes or so. Considering the crime rate was fairly non-existent, for a murder to happen, not only a murder, but a murder on this scale, it was completely shocking for the community.
I think local people found it extraordinary that such an incident could happen here. I think, like all major crimes that happen in what everybody would regard as somewhere quiet and peace-loving, it adds to people's fear that something else could happen, or something else could happen as a result of it.
Police immediately cordon off the crime scene.
The big issue you've got here is you're out in the open. So there's two things. There's the weather, so rain can come and wash away your evidence. But secondly, you've got the issue of privacy. This is a really busy road, there's lots of traffic coming through, and you need to protect the privacy of that individual. That's really important.
Really what you want to do is secure and preserve as much evidence as you can. So there would have been things like identifying where the scene is, making sure that it was cordoned off, that there was enough police officers to ensure that nobody stumbled across the scene.
Beyond the scene, you might be looking at further searches. Has anything discarded, any clothing, any weapons, etc. So this particular point is very important from a forensic point of view. So you would want to be able to get some of your experts down, you want your crime scene manager, you'd really want your pathologist to be coming down to having a look at the scene, just so they have a full understanding of what's here, so that they can do a better job down the line.
And what I would do there is I'd have a discussion with the crime scene manager about the best way of removing the body to a hospital, but also making sure that we didn't lose any evidence while we were in that process, because the evidence that you might lose might be the only evidence that you get that helps you with the case.
Once you start moving a body, then the issue there is a potential loss of evidence, so there'll be some sampling requirements there and then, even in the circumstances where a body's been burnt. For example, there may well be fibres that have been transferred from the offender to the body, or alternatively to the suitcase, that haven't been damaged. It's really important to pick those up at that point.
The body is removed, and police focus on one thing.
But I think when you look at the wider picture around this is somebody's life. This is that they've lost, and you know what I really want to do is find out who the family is, who are the relatives and the friends of this individual, and they need informing at the earliest opportunity.
This was going to be a huge challenge for the police now, because there's absolutely nothing to go by. They've just found a torso. There's nothing to identify the person, no fingerprints.
When you're looking at the difficulty presented by not being able to make an identification, the first things that we considered were things like the police database, and then we started looking at people who were missing, but because we had quite a wide geographical area, it was looking at people who were perhaps missing from West Yorkshire, South Yorkshire, Greater Manchester, as well as Derbyshire. But it's an arterial route, could have been from anywhere.
With very little to go on, the pressure is on for the police to try to identify the body.
You head towards the things that you are quite confident that will bring about an identification. But then when the obvious start to go, then it progressively becomes more and more difficult. And you start considering any other locations or any other information that you may get that you think will help you identify who this person was. So it made it a really difficult inquiry where we were having to be very, very precise around the investigative tactics that we used to try and find out who were the people who were involved.
Whilst the police await lab results from the pathologist's examination of the body, their attention turns to other lines of inquiry.
So the first point of call for the police now would have been to conduct local inquiries, asking people if they'd seen anything, if they'd heard anything.
When these things initially happen, all sorts of stories start to abound.
But the question on everybody's lips is, who is the victim?
Foremost in my mind was, there is a family somewhere whose loved one has been murdered, and they don't know about it.
In the picturesque Peak District, police have launched a murder investigation after an unidentified body was discovered in a suitcase which had been set alight.
So the condition of the body when we found it, the head had been removed, both hands had been removed, and the feet had been removed. There were two things that I sort of realised quite quickly. One, that was a deposition site. That wasn't where the murder had taken place. That was where the body had been placed afterwards. And the second thing was, and it was around whether the victim and the offender knew each other. And I took the view that why would one take the steps to hide somebody's identity if they didn't know each other? So I sort of realised in my own mind that if I worked out who the victim was, I would be able to work out who the offender was. And if I worked out who the offender was, I'd be able to work out who the victim was.
Unable to identify their victim, police await the results of the post-mortem.
Slightly unusually, there was no cause of death. So this tells us that there was no marks or scars or any wounds on the body parts that we had recovered, and clearly the victim's head had been removed. When we looked at the information that we did have from the post-mortem, this was a light-skinned male, and that's all that we were able really to glean from that. From the post-mortem, there were no marks, scars, tattoos or anything that would have assisted us making an identification.
Police trawl the missing persons database for any clues as to who their victim could be.
At the time, there was a lot of missing persons cases, so this could have been absolutely anybody.
There's quite a lot of missing people reported every single day in Derbyshire. And it was a case of refreshing those every single day, because the person may not be reported on day 1 or day 2 or day 3, but every single day going through those the detail of who those individuals were and seeing if we could make a connection between the body that we got and that person who was missing.
With little to go on, Derbyshire Constabulary hold a press conference.
The purpose of today's press conference is to ask for the public's help to identify the victim. We are working with other forces to ascertain whether our victim may have been reported missing in a neighbouring county, but we recognise that he might not have been reported missing at all. We are therefore asking members of the public to come forward if they have not seen a neighbour or a friend or a colleague, or indeed any members of their family recently. A special call centre has been set up to take calls from across the UK, and we are urging people to provide information in relation to this murder investigation.
Information soon starts to filter into the police.
It became apparent that a number of dog walkers had seen the suitcase, but hadn't realised exactly what was inside.
So in order to better understand the time frame that we're looking at and understand when the body may have been put in the car park, we did substantial inquiries with people who'd been on the road. We were asking for people who'd got dash cam footage or people that had driven past. And there were a few positive responses out of that, which were able to tell us that the fire had been set late the night before.
With 3 different drivers claiming to have seen a fire around 11:30 p.m. on the 9th of October, officers on the ground can now focus on who was in the area around that time, in a bid to identify the potential killer.
So that was really useful from the initial investigation point of view to be able to really narrow those timelines so you could concentrate on that time period and work out from there what the offender had done, where he'd been, where he'd likely to travel to and from.
Police now ramp up their inquiries.
There was a bolt out of the blue, and we got a conversation. We got a phone call in from South Yorkshire to inform us that there was actually an ANPR camera on the A628. So the phone call that we got on that day was, do you know you've got an ANPR camera on the 628? And no, we didn't, but thanks very much for telling us. That's really great.
Police immediately trawl through the automatic number plate recognition cameras to establish which vehicles had passed through the area on the night in question.
The police followed ANPR camera footage and located a Mercedes vehicle that triggered the camera just after 11 o'clock on Sunday the 9th, the evening before, and then didn't actually make it all the way across Woodhead Pass Road and to trigger the other ANPR camera at the other end.
It was the only vehicle that passed in the window of opportunity. So every other vehicle only went in one direction, either towards Manchester or towards Yorkshire.
All the vehicles, over 200 that had travelled along that road within the time period, down to one that had turned around and returned back to the Manchester area.
That was a strong indication that that vehicle was the one that deposited the body here on the night of the 9th.
After 10 days of round-the-clock investigations, and still having no clue as to the identity of their victim or suspect, this discovery is key.
The Mercedes triggered the camera on the evening before between 23:09 and 23:26. So straight away that was something I was very interested in, and we started to make some inquiries as to who might be the owner and what might be the significance of that vehicle.
This was absolutely key in the investigation. After 10 days of not finding anything, they needed to find out who this silver Mercedes belonged to.
As it happened, the vehicle didn't have any insurance, and so there was a reason to go and stop it and speak to the driver and have a look at the vehicle.
After further investigation, police discover that the vehicle is registered to someone living in Manchester.
So the owner of the vehicle was somebody called Ming Jiang.
Once the vehicle had been identified, it was registered to Ming Jiang, and therefore this triggered for the police to monitor him, make inquiries as to where he lived, inquiries of where he went.
There was so much pressure on the police. At this point in the investigation, it was very time sensitive. After 10 days, they really needed to find this person. At this point, the person who committed the crime could have run away, they could have covered up, or they could have very much so committed again.
Initial inquiries reveal Ming Jiang lives in Manchester, so Derbyshire Constabulary enlist the help of their colleagues over there.
When Greater Manchester Police assisted us, they were able to locate the vehicle, and because it was driven without any insurance, we were able to seize it. And when we seized the vehicle, we were then able to forensically examine it. And what I was looking for in that forensic examination was to find any evidence that might link to the body that we've got and the scene that we'd preserved some days before.
The police found a speck of blood in the rear that was the size of a 10p coin.
This was a really, really big moment in the investigation. What I would be looking to find out there is a blood spot in the boot of the vehicle, the same as the blood that we found at the scene. So the DNA was sent away for comparison. It was the longest 24 hours I can imagine. Eventually it came back, and it came back with the news that we were really hoping for, and that was that the blood in the boot matched the DNA of the blood at the scene.
The blood match in the boot of the car puts Ming Jiang at the forefront of the investigation.
I felt this was the first time we were getting a breakthrough and first time we were getting an indication as to what may have taken place here. So as soon as we got the positive information about the DNA hit, it was a case of let's get this person arrested at the earliest opportunity.
So Ming Jiang was arrested on the 20th of October. They'd attended a casino in Manchester where they believed he was, and he was arrested at that location.
Now that the police have Ming Jiang in custody for questioning, time is of the essence to find evidence linking him to the murder.
What is also part of the inquiry is to start doing an evidential search around him to understand where he lived, what his movements were, and whether there was any other evidence that we'd be able to glean from his home address.
The police searched the home address and they found bloodstains all over the carpet. There was blood dispersion across all of the walls. They had been painted over and quite a shoddy clean-up had taken place. It was an extensive clean-up, but there was still blood throughout the flat and in the bathroom.
There was traces of blood absolutely everywhere that weren't immediately apparent to the eye. But there were things like the blood had seeped through the laminate flooring. There was blood that was soaked into the cushions on the sofa. There was blood on the walls and on the ceiling.
So the scene was a really rich source of evidence for us. The main evidence we got were 2 finger marks in blood. So we got one under a table. The evidence you're really looking for there is the offender's fingerprint in the victim's blood. And getting that in 2 places was very, very critical evidence.
At this point, it's absolutely safe for the police to say that the murder took place in this apartment.
Ten days into the investigation of the body in the suitcase found in a Derbyshire village, police have discovered a car linked to the murder and have made an arrest.
A forensics team investigated the car. They swabbed the blood. This matched the torso that was found in the suitcase. So at this point, the police were then able to arrest Mr. Ming Jiang.
Forensic tests reveal the blood on the torso in the suitcase is a match for the blood in Jiang's flat in Manchester. making Ming Jiang their #1 suspect.
So the investigation moved over to Manchester because it became clear from the Derbyshire point of view that the offence had actually taken place in Manchester. As a result of their inquiries, that took them to the flat at Falconwood Way in Beswick. And as a result of what they found there, they felt very strongly that that was actually the place of the murder. And so as a result of that would then become a Manchester investigation.
But police are no closer to identifying their victim.
So as the inquiry goes on, the stress and the pressure builds. As a senior investigating officer, it's a privilege to do that role. But you do take the responsibility of having to investigate the death of somebody, and you owe that responsibility to the family of the victim. So I was really concerned about finding out who that was and getting that information to them at the earliest opportunity.
However, searches of their suspect and his car have led to a discovery.
When we did the evidential search of the Mercedes vehicle, we found some banking documents of another person called Yang Lu.
He had certain possessions on his person. At the time, he had his passport, he had his bank cards.
And that led us to an address in Salford at Media City. And there were some lines of inquiry that we needed to conduct at that address and find out what the relationship was with this person and how they fitted into the inquiry.
Police immediately sent officers to Yang Lu's address.
There was no answer, it was nowhere to be seen by anybody. So I made the decision that we were going to force entry into that apartment and find out really who this person was. So we forced entry into the address at Media City. Nothing particularly remarkable about the address, but what it did allow us to do was take some items from there which we knew the owner of that apartment would have left their DNA on. So very quickly we were able to send that away for analysis.
Finally, there is a breakthrough. Results come back matching Yang Lu's DNA to the torso, as well as the blood found in Ming Jiang's flat and car. Almost 2 weeks after the discovery, police have the name of their victim.
So what we did find out was that Yang Lu was a 27-year-old male, originally from China.
Yang Lu came to the UK in 2000 to study, where he went to the University of Leeds. His family actually worked really, really hard to save money so that he could study in the UK and achieve his goals and his dreams.
He finished his master's degree, and after that he stayed here and become a shares and stock trader.
He'd not brought any of his family with him over here, so if you look at the reasons why he may not have been reported missing, his family simply didn't know that he wasn't where he should have been.
Police now have the harrowing task of informing their victim's family.
This was a really difficult case from a family point of view. Under normal circumstances, we'd want to inform the family in person. And in the end, we actually had to make the call to the family in order to inform them. That's something that we wouldn't normally do under any circumstances, but unfortunately with the distance involved, we had no other option. I arranged for contact through Interpol with the Chinese authorities in order to let the family know. In the meantime, we allocated family liaison officers in order that we could make the process as smooth as possible.
Yang's family were absolutely devastated when they found out, their only son had been murdered. Not only murdered, but in such a vicious way.
And then they arrived in the UK in the second week of November.
Yang was very close to his family. They spoke on the phone near enough every single day. He actually vowed to go back to China and look after his family if one of them was to fall ill. And I think that just shows the tight-knit relationship they have, because he'd built himself this fantastic life in the UK and he was really willing to give that up to go back and look after his family.
When the family was here, then I helped them in different ways because they are not they can't speak English. So most of the time that if they have something do not understand about the police procedure, and I help to explain them.
They were completely grief-stricken. They had lost their only son, who had come to the United Kingdom to study at university. He was a very clever young academic man and a very bright young man, and they were deprived of their son.
With time running out to hold their suspect in custody, police need to work fast to build enough evidence to charge him.
Ming Jiang is a danger to the public, and we would really want to be in a position where he'd be charged at that point. The secondary issue is he's a big flight risk. We'd be worried about him kind of moving back to China or elsewhere.
We had to prove that he was the person that had committed that murder. We knew he was involved and could prove that to the extent, and we then had to build a case.
There's no doubt that Ming Jiang tried to cover his tracks quite extensively, but the problem is there was just too much evidence. The evidence there in particular was extremely strong. It's almost the best evidence you can find at a scene, which was Yang Lu's blood and Ming Jiang's fingerprint.
Police now believe Ming Jiang murdered Yang Lu in his flat, dismembered his body, and dumped his torso in a suitcase before setting light to it. But they need to work out the link between the pair and establish when the murder happened, so trawl CCTV footage in the days leading up to the discovery of the suitcase.
CCTV footage revealed a man getting off the tram in Manchester. He crossed the road to meet another man, and they went in the direction of a flat in Beswick.
That tram stop was the closest one to where Ming Jiang's home address was.
The male he met up with perfectly fit the description of Ming Jiang. And in addition to that, we had telephone evidence that showed the two phones of Ming Jiang and Yang Lu came together. And interestingly, from that point onwards, the phones always remained together. And that was the very last time that Yang Lu was seen.
With the evidence building, police make a decision.
So I authorised one charge of murder.
Ming Jiang denies any involvement in the murder, so the police and prosecution need to build a case for trial and establish a motive, meaning they have to delve deeper into the lives of the two men.
Yang Lu was definitely a responsible young man. He invested in stocks and shares, and he knew how to make money. He was very clever in that sense. He'd built himself this brand new life in the UK. He really had a bright future ahead of him. Yang really enjoyed gambling. He was a very big gambler. He'd go to casinos quite often. He always gambled within his means, though. He was never irresponsible in that respect. Even though he had the money to gamble, he never went above and beyond.
So Ming Jiang was in a very different situation to Yang Lu. Ming Jiang was originally from China. He moved over to the UK. He lived in the Beswick area in North Manchester. He rented that flat. At the time of the murder, he really was in serious debt problems. He'd spent quite a long time at casinos. He was a regular gambler. In fact, so much so that he had VIP status.
We believe that they met in a casino when they shared the same interest to gamble. They met in a Manchester casino.
But Yang Lu could never have imagined that their relationship could be so deadly.
Ming Jiang was very well known in the casino community. In some casinos, he had quite specialised status due to the large amounts of money that he was gambling. Yet in other casinos, he had markers on him due to his erratic and volatile behaviour. It was my understanding that he was a great fun guy to be around when he was winning, but it was a very, very different case when he was losing.
He lost a huge amount of money, and as far as we know, he's sort of a £200,000 debt, and he's been chasing by the debtor, the creditor within the community.
It was the Crown's case that Ming Jiang had accrued extensive debts. We had knowledge that he had historically acquired over £270,000 worth of debt within 2 casinos. He was struggling to pay off those debts. We knew that he had pawned some wristwatches for over £15,000 to try and keep the debtors at bay.
Getting more and more desperate to pay off his debts, it appears Ming Jiang hatched an evil plan.
Ming Jiang was in huge amounts of debt. He had no income or wherewithal with which to repay that debt, and the only way he believed he could do that was either through his addiction of gambling and waiting for the big win, or through extreme measures. He used the alternative of planning the murder of his friend.
When the police found Ming Jiang, he was actually in possession of Mr. Yang Lu's passport and his bank cards. So at this point, it's safe to assume that he was trying to assume his identity.
So Ming Jiang had taken Yang Lu's life and then he took his identity. He basically used all his personal information in order to extract money through his bank cards. He even tried to sell his flat, and he was making good progress on that at the point at which he'd been arrested. There was nothing that he wouldn't do in order to extract as much money and value out of Yang Lu.
In Manchester, Ming Jiang's trial for the murder of Yang Lu begins.
So the trial was conducted in April of 2017. Shortly prior to the trial hearing, we did meet with the victims' parents, and we had to reassure them that we would do our utmost to be able to obtain justice for their son.
The court hears how Ming Jiang had a checkered history.
Ming Jiang was a Hong Kong national. Before he came to the UK, he was working as cabin crew for a German airline, where he was actually convicted for credit card fraud.
The police found that he had convictions in Germany for shoplifting, convictions for identity fraud and forgery of documents in Switzerland. He had convictions for credit card fraud in Scotland. So as a result of that, as the reviewing lawyer, it was my job then to write international letters of request. I had to make formal requests to Germany and Switzerland to obtain evidence of those convictions, which we then subsequently at the trial hearing submitted as evidence of bad character.
The prosecution believes Ming Jiang was planning to use his experience of identity fraud to build a new life for himself.
It appeared quite clearly that Ming Jiang understood his way around the financial system, and the kind of things that he did and the way that he adopted the identity, for example, by using Yang Lu's phone to contact banks, etc. That showed quite a little bit of knowledge of how to basically defraud and use identity theft to his advantage.
This was premeditated, it was planned. He had devised a plan as to how he was going to assume his victim's identity and obtain all of his assets and walk away. He was probably going to walk away from his debts, take what money he could get from his victim and return to China. I believe that would have been his plan.
The motive behind the murder was quite clearly greed. It was obvious that Ming Jiang understood that Yang Lu had a lot of money. He lived in a nice area of Manchester. He owned his own flat. He dabbled in stocks and shares. And the concept that they'd had together, we believe that there would have been some understanding from Ming Jiang's point of view that Yang Lu was pretty wealthy.
During the trial, Ming Jiang's story changes several times.
Ming Jiang showed no remorse whatsoever throughout the whole process. He came out with bizarre and incredulous accounts, changing the overall story on a number of occasions. Initially, he claimed that Yang Lu was an escort and that they were in a relationship. There was absolutely no evidence to support that.
So he wasn't consistent in his account that he was providing to the police. He did pursue that through to the trial hearing and maintained that it was a different Chinese male called Mr. Wong who had committed the act of murder, and he tried to distance himself by using this fictional character.
He later on claimed that there was a kind of third-party gangster-type individual who was involved that Yang Lu owed money to. Again, from an investigation point of view, we were able to show that that simply wasn't the case.
Ming Jiang fabricated Mr. Wong, and he gave the phone number to the police. However, when the police checked the record of the phone, and it's found out that the phone number is only created a date before they believed Liu Yong died.
So all the explanations that Ming Jiang provided were easily discounted and showed that he was just making things up as he went along.
The jury has shown CCTV from the night police believe Yang Lu was murdered, in a bid to prove that Ming Jiang was the last to see him.
The evidence we used, we had a digital sequence of events that displayed all of the CCTV footage and the appropriate stills. So we had the stills showing that Ming Jiang was friends with the victim and that they had attended the casino together on the 3rd of October. And then subsequently, Ming Jiang had clearly lured him to his flat on the 5th of October, and we had a still digital photo of Yang Lu leaving the Metrolink tram stop at Velo Park, which was the closest one to Ming Jiang's home address.
From a CCTV point of view, that was the last point at which Yang Lu had been seen, so that was on the 5th of October.
So his movements shortly after the time that we believe that he had killed Yang Lu, he used the bank cards that he'd acquired. He used them at B&Q to purchase cleaning products, paint with which to paint the flat. He went to the petrol station on numerous occasions, and he was seen to be filling one, if not two, containers of petrol, which we then subsequently believe that he used to set the body on fire.
Having killed his supposed friend and made attempts to clean the evidence, it appears Ming Jiang goes back to doing what he loves best.
In the early hours of the 6th of October, Ming Jiang spent 30 minutes at the casino. He also spent time at the casino after the deposition. So in the early hours of the 10th of October, he spent around 4 hours. And if you can imagine, he's literally just taken the torso of the body, he's dumped it up in Tinswhistle, and then he set it on fire, returned back to his flat, and the first thing he does is head to the casino to spend Yang Lu's money and gamble.
His actions aren't the actions of what you would expect a normal person to do. And it's a terrible thing to murder somebody. But then to murder somebody and dismember the body and then dump it and set on fire, it's just an incredibly callous act. And it probably speaks a lot about his character.
After hearing the evidence, the jury retires to consider its verdict.
So the jury in this case sat for 4 weeks, and under normal circumstances, you generally expect around about a day's deliberation per week. So under normal circumstances, it would take 4 days to come to a decision. But in this case, it only took them 4 hours, and that shows you really how overwhelming the evidence was.
After weeks of evidence is a very short period of time. And I believe would demonstrate that they were absolutely sure in a very short space of time that Ming Jiang was guilty of this offence.
At the point that they gave their verdict, Ming Jiang was completely emotionless. He showed nothing at all. At that point, he went back into custody and sentencing took place a week later. The judge actually sentenced him in his absence because he refused to come to court.
The presiding judge made a point of stating that the starting point for a sentence would be 30 years due to it being solely the sole purpose being for gain and in this case for money. However, he outlined aggravating features such as the extensive dismemberment of the body, the complete lack of remorse, and the misleading of evidence, and he made a point of saying that it might be that the authorities never deem him to be safe to be returned to the community and that he could spend the rest of his life in prison.
On the 2nd of May 2017, Ming Jiang is sentenced to life in prison with a minimum of 33 years. He has never revealed the whereabouts of Yang Lu's limbs or head.
The saddest thing about this murder is Ming Jiang's greed caused the loss of the life of a young 36-year-old man, leaving behind two very grief-stricken, distraught parents.
His family didn't know the last time they spoke to him on the phone, the last time they saw him in person was going to be the last time. I think, yeah, it's really devastating that they never got to say goodbye to their only son.
The killing of a grandmother, a mother and her two daughters sparked the biggest investigation Wales has ever seen, leading to 3 suspects within the police. The chilling Murder in the Valleys continues new Wednesday at 9.
I was thinking, who would be capable of such a heinous crime?
I was shielded from the raw details.
It did change the village at the time.
As a fledgling serial killer, and that's what he is, I'm glad that at least he was nipped in the bud.
On the morning of the 30th of October 1966, a discovery was made that was to plunge the village of Beenham into a nightmare that its inhabitants would have to live with for nearly half a century. The village of Beenham in Berkshire is only 51 miles from London, but in 1966, this rural community may as well have been 1 million miles away.
Back in the 60s, we all knew each other. It was more tight-knit than it is now. It's still a very close village and everyone knows each other and looks out for each other.
In the 1960s, Beenham would have been a quiet village. We never got called up to there for any problems at all.
Early in the morning of Saturday, the 29th of October in 1966, police received a call about a missing 17-year-old au pair called Yolande Waddington.
Yolande had only been working at the farm as an au pair for a matter of days before she went missing and was then reported missing by her employer.
At the same time, a discovery was made on land belonging to the farm where Yolande was a nanny.
Some clothing was found in a barn by one of the farm workers. He thought no more of it because previously other clothes had been found there. It was a location used by courting couples.
Unaware of the clothing, police spread the word about the missing 17-year-old.
The following day, further items of clothing were also found within the barn when farm workers went and moved some bales of hay. At that point, Yolande had been reported missing, so the fact that the clothing was found in the barn reasonably close to where she was living raised suspicions, and her employer was called to the scene.
It didn't take long before everyone's worst nightmares were realised.
On the 30th of October, a body was found by her employer in a ditch close by to the barn where her clothing was found. She was naked, or almost naked. Her hands had been tied behind her back with twine, or baling twine. She had an item of clothing wrapped around her face and stuffed into her mouth. She had an injury to her rib cage just below her left breast, and she also had baling twine wrapped around her neck. And it was that what killed her.
1966 was a time before DNA and databases. All they had was good old-fashioned police work.
It was obvious from the outset that it was a murder, and it was treated as such.
Rodney Watson and Gary Deacon were local PCs at that time.
A telephone call came in to the effect that a body had been found in a ditch in a farm track at Beanham. It was quickly established that we had received a report of a missing girl called Yolandi Waddington, and as a result, I, amongst others, went to the scene to secure the scene.
Murders weren't known in those days as such, so everybody was sort of rushing around trying to get things organised, and I had to go to sort of do the search that was going to be taking place at the scene. We were greeted with open fields, rural tracks, the barn down the road, and farm tracks, and basically all rural area. We were searching at the time with sort of what would be garden instruments, the rake, hose, garden forks, shears for cutting the grass.
The atmosphere at the scene was quite sombre. Obviously, it was realised that the body in the ditch was a female and matched the description of Yolandi Waddington, and she'd obviously passed away.
You'd read about it in textbooks and everything, and you'd done it at a training school, but to be actually involved in a murder search was an experience.
I actually conveyed Yolandi Waddington to the Royal Berkshire Hospital, to the mortuary. I mean, I was thinking, you know, who would be capable of such a heinous crime?
Identified by her employer, police were dispatched to give Yolandi Waddington's family the horrific news. Giles, Yolanda's younger brother, was 8 in 1966.
But I do recall this picture of opening the front door and finding a policeman in his full sort of uniform standing in front of me going, "I need to speak to your mum and dad." And that's the only real record I have. And then I have recollections of lots of people being in the house that were a bit unusual. And I would assume, in that case, there were various detectives.
This had been Yolanda's first job away from the family home in Newbury, and despite only being in Beanham a few days, she was known as a friendly, talkative girl. News of the murder travelled through this country village fast.
I can remember the police presence. There were suddenly lots of policemen everywhere. When you came out of school or if you went to the village shop, there were policemen around, and it is quite memorable, something like that. It did change the village at the time then.
Berkshire was really a rural county, and apart from the normal problems that you had, maybe the occasional pub fights at the weekend, murders were unknown as such.
A call was made to London.
In 1966, it was standard practice for the Berkshire Constabulary to request the assistance of a Detective Chief Superintendent and a Detective Sergeant from the Metropolitan Police.
And it was felt that Metropolitan officers had the necessary experience and expertise in order to lead on these rare and serious offences.
With Scotland Yard on the scene, the investigation continued.
In the following days, a thorough search took place of the barn in the immediate area. Various items were seized, sacks from within the barn. Yolande's clothing, a comb was found, a knife was found, which was believed to have been the knife that caused her injury.
The items were sent to the Metropolitan Police Lab in London for analysis, and then officers concentrated on piecing together Yolande's final movements.
Yolande Waddington was last seen on Friday the 28th of October 1966 in the Six Bells public house, Beanham. She'd gone in there to buy a packet of cigarettes. She appears to have smoked one of the cigarettes within the bar and then left. That was the last time she was seen. It was always felt, I believe, that the offender would have lived in and around the Beanham area because of the isolated nature of where Yolande was found and the fact where she was last seen within the village centre. And therefore, investigators felt that the answer to who was responsible laid within the village. Everyone within the village was interviewed. The inquiry centred on who was within the Six Bells at the time she was, who left shortly after she did, and if they did leave, where did they go?
During their inquiries, officers began unearthing information that could prove crucial to capturing Yolande's killer.
The landlady of the Six Bells was interviewed. She remembers selling a packet of cigarettes to a girl fitting Yolande's description. A man by the name of David Burgess was in the pub at the same time Yolande was there. He'd been there the majority of the evening and left shortly after she did.
Just days after the brutal murder of teenager Yolande Waddington, police already had a suspect. In 1966, the rural village of Beanham in Berkshire was left reeling when the body of 17-year-old au pair Yolande Waddington was found naked and strangled in a farm ditch. Local police had been bolstered by the arrival of the Met Scotland Yard. Items belonging to Yolande found at the scene had immediately been sent for analysis, and after a few days, they already had a suspect, a local man called David Burgess.
He was of interest because he was in the pub, the Six Bells, at the time Yolande was there, and left shortly after she did. The following day, he was seen with scratches on his face. He stated that he'd fallen into a bush on his way home. Police spoke to him. He stated he had been in the Six Bells and then had walked home from the Six Bells.
With nothing else to go on, 19-year-old local lad David Burgess was released, and the investigation moved on.
Everyone within the village was interviewed to establish where they were on the Friday that Yolande went missing.
Over the next few weeks, the usually quiet village of Beanham was a hive of police activity as they hunted Yolande's murderer.
I can remember the parents being really quite concerned of us kids going out to play, and the people in the village were quite scared.
At the time, our school was just down at the end of the lane there, and we used to just run up the lane and round and home. But once this happened, then all the mums were always at the school to meet us and walk us home. The police presence outside the hall, they were always there every day, which was obviously quite strange for Beanham to have so many police around.
There's always ripples to any murder, but in a very small community, I think that those ripples are felt very, very keenly. Immediately, you start to look at your neighbour and feel suspicious, and immediately there's a fear, and a fear of people who are close to you and known to you. This is not the kind of thing that happens to us. It's the kind of thing that we read about in newspapers or we watch in plots on TV or in Hollywood films.
After almost 2 weeks of inquiries, where over 1,000 statements were taken, Yolande's clothing and effects had been analysed. The results were to send the investigation in a direction that would end up making history.
During the investigation at the barn, her jumper was found. On that jumper was blood. When that blood was examined, it was found not to be hers. Following that, it was decided to request blood from every person, every male, over the age of 16 that lived in and around Beenham.
This was a bold move by police, as the science behind it was in its infancy.
Limitations of forensic science testing in the 1960s basically revolved around the limitations of testing for blood. We knew that there were 4 blood groups, and you could break it down a little bit more, but you could never rule somebody conclusively in as a suspect. You could only rule them conclusively out.
Progress, though, had recently been made.
In 1966, 2 forensic serologists working for the Metropolitan Police came up with what they thought would be a new technique that could be used for forensic applications. The new application would help to further distinguish individuals on the basis of their blood.
By early November 1966, police decided to push on with what became the first mass blood screening ever attempted in the UK.
Posters were put around the village inviting men over 16 to give blood, and also showing a knife similar to the one found in the barn. Following the publication of those photos, David Burgess approached an officer within the village and told him that he wants to own a knife very similar to that.
Yolande's murder would have been very big news in a very small village. So here is a concerned citizen who is giving police information about a knife that they've recently lost. That's very helpful, but it becomes slightly more suspicious when you also factor into account that Burgess was also the last person to see Yolande alive.
Before a single blood sample had been taken, David Burgess had re-emerged as the police's main suspect.
David Burgess was arrested. In interview, he stuck to his story. The fact that he was in the pub, he couldn't dispute that because other customers had seen him. And the scratches, he explained those by saying he'd fallen into a bush on his way home because he'd had too much to drink.
Despite letting him go again, David Burgess, who worked at the local gravel pits and was already known to the police as a troublemaker, soon became the subject of gossip amongst the local bobbies.
I was kept abreast of things through snippets of colleagues who were undertaking the parts of the inquiry teams, and it became obvious that David Burgess was the chief suspect, although it was proving difficult to back up his claims with actually corroborative evidence.
Frustrated they couldn't prove Burgess's guilt, police continued looking into other local men.
My dad actually got arrested for the murder for Yolande, because what happened was the bus stop used to be outside the Six Bells pub, and he was in the pub and he had a Land Rover, and he said to her, because he was tipping down around, sit in my Land Rover while you wait for the bus. And somebody must have clocked that, and he got arrested and taken in, but in the next day was released, so they know he never done it.
There are 16 men that were of particular interest to the investigation. However, one by one, those men were eliminated.
With the investigation floundering, police still had what they hoped would be the ace up their sleeve. On November the 23rd, 1966, blood samples were taken from every male between the ages of 16 and 50 living in Beenham.
In excess of 200 men had their blood taken. The type of blood grouping that was done was new.
This case was certainly one of the first times that mass blood screening was used. The most well-known instance happened in the 1980s, but this predates it by at least 20 years.
Police were hoping that identifying whose blood was on Yolande's jumper would lead them to her killer.
They were able to say that only 2% of the population would have had blood of that type, and that was borne out by the fact that out of in excess of 200 men that gave their blood, only 4 people had the same blood grouping as that found on Yolande's jumper.
Police were desperately hoping David Burgess was one of them.
It wasn't his blood on the jumper, or his blood didn't appear to match the grouping that was found on Yolande's jumper, so there wasn't a great deal more that the police could do. With the 4 men whose blood matched the grouping of the blood found on Yolande's jumper, They're all subject of intense investigation. All of them had alibis for what they were doing and therefore were ruled out of the investigation.
It had been a massive gamble to take this unprecedented step in the investigation. Unfortunately, it hadn't paid off, and the police were back to square one.
The investigation were obviously limited as to what they could do forensically. They did all they could in relation to try and show who was at the scene with Yolande, but back in 1966, they couldn't progress it.
With no new evidence coming to light, there was a difficult decision to make.
The investigation finished in March 1967. The officers had done all they could to try and establish who was responsible for Yolande's death, but unfortunately, after almost 6 months, they had no evidence that could be used to charge someone with her death.
I imagine that the killer would be feeling that they'd gotten away with it, they'd been successful, and they'd be feeling quite a thrill from that. They'd be feeling empowered and invincible.
The investigation was never officially closed, and suspicions remained about David Burgess. But for now, the evidence from the scene was stored for future analysis. Despite all the police's efforts, the murder of Yolande Waddington remained unsolved. After 6 months, the investigation into the murder of 17-year-old au pair Yolande Waddington had been stopped. The village of Beenham looked as if it was going to be living with a killer on the loose for the foreseeable future. Inquiries may have ended, but despite there not being a match in the UK's first mass blood screening, local troublemaker David Burgess remained the police's prime suspect. This was a village on the edge. On the 17th of April 1967, the village of Beenham hit the news again.
We've got another call come in to say that 2 9-year-old girls hadn't returned home after going out to play in the village of Beenham. And we all thought, no, this cannot be. Surely nothing's happened to them. But I attended with a lot of officers, probably 20 to 30, and volunteers from the village. And we searched the area by some gravel pits, and having been issued with the whistles to blow if anything was found, after about half an hour or so, somebody blew a whistle.
The whistle could mean only one thing.
When the call came in to say 2 bodies had been found, then you get a bit disheartened, you think, how sad. And it was a lonely area, these 2 young children as they were out there on their own, and something had happened. Devastating, really, yes.
The awful news reverberated around the village.
We were really in shock, and the teachers were in shock, parents were in shock, and it was really quite scary, actually.
Police quickly got to work. They were determined that this murder would not go unsolved.
It was obvious that these 2 girls had been murdered, so an investigation took place.
It wasn't long before police had a person of interest, and the name didn't come as much of a surprise.
Because David Burgess was one of the main suspects in Yolande's case, the fact that he worked so close to where the bodies of the 2 9-year-olds were found made him a strong suspect almost from the outset. He was interviewed, his clothing was seized, and from one of his boots some blood was found, and that blood grouping matched one of the girls.
David Burgess was charged with the monstrous killing of the 2 9-year-old girls, Jeanette Wigmore and Jacqueline Williams.
We'd heard that Burgess had been arrested on the possibility of committing the murders of the 2 schoolgirls, and I suppose we were all really delighted.
In July of 1967, just 4 months after the horrific killings of Jeanette and Jacqueline, David Burgess was presented at Reading Crown Court accused of their murder. It was a swift, uncomplicated hearing.
Burgess stood trial and was convicted of both the murders of both 9-year-olds in July 1967.
Escorted to his life sentence by Rodney Watson, Burgess's behaviour was, under the circumstances, bizarre.
And I was handcuffed to him in the dock, but most of the time he didn't really seem worried about what was happening. He kept on looking round, occasionally laughing, chuckling to himself, and not really worried about proceedings. And a very strange person I found to be in that position. I would have been worried myself. And then he was remanded in custody and then taken down and then released into the prison authorities. And that was the last time I ever saw him, in fact.
Now, I know that when I assess psychopaths, some of the things that I look for are callousness, lack of empathy, but just a general blunting of emotional response and effect. Now, here is somebody who is acting very oddly indeed. We know that he's not got a mental illness, but you have to question what else is going on.
Rodney's macabre introduction to the darker side of police work was over. But there was still one question that remained unanswered. Who had murdered Yolandi Waddington? In 1968, a potential answer came from prison.
David Burgess admitted to being responsible for causing Yolandi's death to a prison officer, and that prison officer subsequently made a statement to police.
Could the man who police had always suspected of Yolandi's depraved murder be confessing?
On April 3rd, 1968, Burgess was interviewed in prison by police officers in relation to the admissions he'd made concerning Yolandi's death. To those officers, he said words to the effect of, "You'll have to prove it."
The fact that somebody was prepared to indulge in this sort of conversation and admissions and them saying you prove it as if it was some sort of game, totally disrespectful to the girl and the family and the family of the two other girls.
In talking about Yolandi's murder and taking responsibility for that murder, Burgess is meeting two needs. First of all, he's letting people know how clever he is because he's got away with murder. But also, crucially, he's re-engaging with that murder and re-engaging with the emotions that that murder brought about in him. So he's feeling powerful, he's feeling a thrill. And let's face it, when you're incarcerated, there are very few other outlets for that type of thing. If you can't commit a murder, you talk about a murder.
Police decided to test Burgess's blood one more time.
Following his admissions, the jumper was tested yet again in relation to the blood found, and a report was submitted to the Director of Public Prosecutions. However, the blood grouping still didn't match that of Burgess, and as a result of that, the Director of Public Prosecutions stated that he didn't believe it was worthwhile pursuing the charge against Burgess.
It was a bitter blow, and it was looking like Yolandi's murder was never going to be solved. In 1996, 48-year-old convicted double child murderer David Burgess absconded from open prison.
At one point, Burgess was on the run for in the region of 18 months and took over the identity of someone that he knew that had died. Was subsequently arrested when he committed an armed robbery. We don't know where he was throughout the 18 months.
Sexual offending by its nature is addictive, and here is an individual who would be at very high risk of reoffending. But that's not to say that other murders would be inevitable, although they are possible.
When I heard that he'd escaped from an open prison, my thoughts were, how could somebody who's killed two 9-year-old girls be deemed safe to allow out into the public?
By February 1998, David Burgess was back in prison, whilst Beanham tried to get back to normal. But the village always had a cloud hanging over it.
There's a very good history of Beanham, which was written by the local history group some 10 years ago now, but it doesn't mention the murders.
It was a subject that was almost taboo.
I would say I would very rarely hear anyone talking about it here in the pub.
As many try to forget, Giles, Yolandi's younger brother, was just finding out the full horror of what had happened to his sister.
I discovered a pile of press cuttings hidden away out of view. Obviously being put away so that I didn't find them, but I did, and there was this sort of Yolande's photograph plastered on the front page, and there was sort of police and other sort of articles. So I found out a little bit to know that my sister had been murdered.
With David Burgess safely back behind bars, advances were being made in DNA analysis, meaning previously unsolved murders were worth revisiting.
In 1985, research published at the University of Leicester proved that new DNA analysis techniques could be used to link specific individuals to offences, and has since been used in many different capacities to solve homicides and sexual assault cases.
This breakthrough led to cold case units being set up by police forces around the country.
I retired in 2007 and then came back in my current role as a member of police staff, reinvestigating historic cases.
Eventually, in September 2010, the Thames Valley Major Crime Review Team turned their attention to the unsolved murder of Yolande Waddington.
So with Yolande's case, we initially looked at what the case was about, looked at what case papers we had, and importantly what exhibits we had, and did an audit of those exhibits to see what was still in existence, and then did an assessment as to what potential there was to use new forensic techniques on those exhibits.
Could advances in forensic sciences finally help police find Yolande's killer 44 years after her murder? Up until 2010, the 1966 murder of Yolande Waddington remained unsolved, despite the police believing that double child murderer David Burgess had been responsible from the very beginning. Then Thames Valley Police decided to reopen Yolande's case to see if DNA could identify and convict her killer. The new investigation began by finding out what evidence had survived.
We had items that were found in the barn, some items of her clothing, but importantly, what was missing was the oatmeal jumper that Yolande was wearing at the time of her death. That was an item from which a bloodstain was found, which wasn't hers, and it was that bloodstain, the grouping from that bloodstain, which was used on the initial investigation to get the blood grouping with which to match against people from within the village.
As the only item belonging to Yolande with someone else's blood on it, the missing jumper was a big blow.
There were another key items that still did exist, and it was those that we were able to submit to the forensic laboratories for further work to take place.
By January 2011, police managed to recover Yolande's headband and a plastic fertiliser bag. Now it was up to the lab to find DNA not belonging to Yolande.
We here at LGC have a cold case team that is dedicated just to cold cases. We'll use whatever available technology is there in order to try and help solve the case.
Locating the evidence was only half the battle. Usable DNA needed to be found.
One of the most important items was the polythene fertiliser bag that was found at the scene of the crime. Because the original note suggested there was blood on there, and obviously they'd got blood grouping results from that item. So we went back to it, and sure enough, there were still crusty blood stains on that item. We then sampled some of those stains and carried out DNA profiling on them and got a good profile.
The lab was quick to give Thames Valley Police the news.
And they said that they had a profile. That profile, a DNA profile that is, that profile was then searched against the National DNA Database, and there was a match against David Burgess.
Already in prison for double murder, David Burgess was in the frame again. But it did pose the question, why hadn't he been a match when he was tested in 1966 or 68?
I would have expected him to match. if the test had been carried out correctly. And unfortunately, we can't go back and recheck that particular test, and we don't have any documentation in order to see whether there might have been a transcription error, a problem in moving information of the actual type onto another page that was used in a report, for example.
As far as the team were concerned, Burgess's blood had been incorrectly categorised in the 60s. But persuading a jury of this wouldn't be easy. They had to use the DNA to prove that the blood had always belonged to Burgess.
Although it was good evidence to have Burgess's DNA on that sack, the problem we had was that he was a local young man, would have had ready access to that barn, so we had to get evidence over and above that, because potentially he could have just said, yes, that's my DNA, I'm local, so what?
Roy Green and his team at LGC continued investigating the evidence.
As we looked through the old case notes that were prepared over 40 years previously, we noticed that one of them, the headband, had a description of it saying grubby, and that was it. But on examining the item, we found that what were thought to be grubby marks were actually blood. The DNA profiling results showed that there was a mixture of DNA on the headband. Some of it could have come from Yolandi, and that's to be expected because it was her item. But also, some of it could have come from David Burgess.
If Burgess's DNA was definitely on the headband, it would show that he'd come into direct contact with Yolandi. Police had to prove beyond any doubt that the DNA was his.
We had to refer to a specialist in genetic statistics at UCL, and he was able to say that, in his opinion, the DNA profile found on her headband was a 1 in a billion match probability to Burgess.
A 1 billion to 1 match was conclusive proof that Burgess and Yolandi had had physical contact. It was time to let the surviving members of Yolandi's family know what was happening.
I tend to try and only make contact with the family when we have new evidence, which hopefully will bring their case to a successful conclusion. In Yolandi's case, I approached Giles, her brother.
There wasn't a sort of sense of relief, a sense of... I can't say that I felt anything. It's a process. And it still feels as though it's a process because it makes no difference to the end result. Yolandi is dead, never to be alive again. The bit that I was worried about was the impact it would have on my dad in his twilight days.
For the police, turning failed investigations around wasn't just about pride.
Each one of our undetected cases has obviously a victim and the victim's family. The impact on families is massive in as much that it's difficult to comprehend what that family's gone through. And when we visit them sort of 10, 20, 30 years after the event, you can still see the impact in as much that there's a picture of their loved one either on the television, on the mantelpiece, and it never goes away. It's something that they think about every day.
My parents were certainly not wanting a repeat. Well, their trust in anybody disappeared, evaporated completely, for the simple reason that their precious daughter had been taken from them.
Pete Byrne and his team had to put together a case to back up the DNA.
It's really, really pleasing to get the forensic result, but that's just the start of it, really. From that moment on, we then have to look at the case and build the case up against Burgess.
Police had to painstakingly trawl through all the evidence from 1966 and find the original witnesses.
They were all seen, if they were still alive, interviewed, asked in relation to their initial statement, whether they wanted to add, alter or correct anything in relation to what they'd said back in 66 to what they could remember in 2011.
In November 2011, the prime suspect in 17-year-old Nanny Yolandi Waddington's murder was interviewed about some of the original evidence from 1966 that had implicated him.
Did you get those scratches because Yolandi scratched your face?
I had nothing whatsoever to do with her death. I've told you that. And you won't believe it because I'm a liar, you said. We're saying the knife that you lost is identical. You say you lost. Is identical to the knife that was used to murder Yolanda Waddington. That's a coincidence, Sam, isn't it? Your missing knife is the same knife. How many people in Venham had a knife similar? How many people? Are they all suspects, are they?
Finally, Burgess was asked about his confession to prison guards.
And you thought it was safe to say that here?
No.
It was safe, wasn't it?
I'd never say something like that if I committed a murder. I wouldn't go around shouting about it.
After we finished interviewing Burgess and he was charged, we then carried on building the case up against him, putting the file in to the CPS, and then getting ready for the trial.
45 years after he'd first been the main suspect in Yolandi Waddington's brutal killing, David Burgess was going to stand trial for her murder.
It's not every day that you get told that your sister's murderer has just been arrested. It was a sort of sense of, wow, that's progress, and significant progress.
On the 18th of June 2012, David Burgess stood trial at Reading Crown Court.
I was confident in the results that we'd obtained, but in the background there was always this mistyping of the original blood grouping results that could be a potential stumbling block.
If the defence could sway the court into believing there was no way that the 2 blood tests done on Burgess in the 60s could have been wrong, he'd get off the murder of Yolandi yet again. It was a difficult time for Giles.
There is no provision whatsoever for, or any preparation that can prepare anybody for facing a trial as a victim's relative.
For David Burgess, it all seemed nothing more than an inconvenience.
I saw him throughout the trial. His attitude didn't seem to have changed at all from when we'd first interviewed him. He just simply appeared bored by the whole proceedings.
The jury and Giles were told all the grisly details.
The fact that she'd been found naked, her clothes had been strewn about, she'd been stabbed, she'd been strangled, the whole thing had been a sexual crime. And that's the bit that was uncomfortable because I found it out for the first time.
Through expert witnesses, the prosecution explained how the original blood tests must have been wrong, and more witnesses called.
One of the key points of the trial was a witness that we'd located in Australia who was living in Beanham just prior to the murder. She gave evidence to the effect that Burgess had attacked her one evening prior to the attack on Yolandi. We were able to use that evidence, what's called bad character evidence, put that before the jury to show the type of man Burgess was.
Once all the witnesses found by Pete Byrne and his team had given evidence, there was only the DNA left.
We're fortunate that the scientist was able to explain to the jury in layman's terms what that DNA consisted of and how he was confident that the DNA that was found on the items belonged to Burgess.
In the end, everything relied upon the jury understanding the complex evidence.
The trial lasted 5 weeks in total. The jury were out for 5 days, after which they came back with an 11-1 majority verdict that Burgess was the killer.
On the 23rd of July 2012, almost half a century after Yolandi Waddington's murder, David Burgess was sentenced to 27 years imprisonment. It was a huge relief to Giles.
For want of the better expression, shouted from the rooftops to say, no matter how old the crime, the resources are now there to provide justice now.
He should be 92 years of age when he's released. I don't think he should ever be released.
Burgess is clearly a sexually motivated repeat killer, and you do wonder how his killing career would have been progressing had he not been caught. But as a fledgling serial killer, and that's what he is, I'm glad that at least he was nipped in the bud.
We're very, very pleased that we got the result. But that's what me and my team do. We reinvestigate the historic cases that are unresolved.
Burgess was sent back to prison, but questions were raised about the 18 months he'd been on the run.
We made sure that forces were also made aware that there was a convicted killer that potentially could have committed offences anywhere within the UK within that time, so we passed on his details to other forces.
By the time Burgess is eligible for parole, he will have spent 73 years behind bars for the 3 murders the police know he's committed. The question is, are there more?
Join the team and face the day-to-day struggle of stamping out crime. Leave it to the experts. Saturday at 10 in the Force North East.
I'm Mike Knoffwood, a 28-year-old businessman. I work for a pretty big and famous company in my hometown. I'm part of the sales team, and there's a business drinking party almost every night. The clients seem to really like the place I chose for the gathering, so I think it was successful. I felt a sigh of relief. My boss is whispering something to our CO. Looks like he's planning for the next place. Probably, they're going to a fancy place with attractive ladies, along with our client CO. I guess us regular employees are calling it quits here. We hailed taxis for the higher-ups to send them off. Our tipsy COs seem to be in high spirits. We made sure nothing was left behind with seniors, and then us regular employees dispersed. My colleagues were heading off to a bar, but I'm not much of a drinker. Despite the invite, I declined and decided to head home early. I wanted to enjoy my only hobby, gaming, when I got home. As I was excitedly heading home, I heard a dispute in a side alley off the main street. Normally, I ignore it, but I stopped in my tracks when I heard a young woman's voice. Squinting into the dark alley, I could see a girl about college-aged and a man about my age arguing about something. The man seemed to be forcing the girl, and she was clearly uncomfortable. "Hey, stop that." She tried to keep her voice down, but it was clear she was rejecting him. The man was holding her arm, seemingly trying to forcefully take her somewhere. The girl appeared to be about the same age as my younger sister. "Hey, maybe you shouldn't be forcing her like that," I called out quietly towards the back of the alley. The man turned around and glared at me. From just one glance, I could tell he was wearing a well-tailored suit. His tie is designer-made. His leather shoes are nicely polished. He seems like a rich kid. "Back off, you're out of your league, man." Quite a mouth on him for a privileged kid. Maybe he's a rich brat gone bad. I sigh inwardly. I just wanted to go home and play games. Stepping into the alley, the humidity instantly rises above the level of the main street. It's probably damp air from the air conditioners attached to both sides of the buildings. But she seems uncomfortable, and you're acting like a thug, so I can't just ignore this. While saying that, I nonchalantly grab his hand, shielding the girl behind me. Talking circles around people is something I'm good at. "Hey, Jenny, do you know this guy?" The man yells as he tries to violently grab the shoulder of the girl behind me. I shield her, making sure his hand doesn't reach her. He clicks his tongue, and then attacked with pretty heavy punch. I absolutely hate violence. I was blown to the wall of the building, hitting my back hard. I taste iron in my mouth. The man looks down at me, now slumped against the building wall. There's a vulgar grin on his face. These kind of guys never stop at one punch. He's the type who gets excited by the violence he inflicts. Just as I try to escape, a kick to my stomach makes me groan. See, just as I thought. I nearly laugh at how well I've read him. Just as the man clenches his fist again, the girl thrusts her smartphone screen in his face. If you don't stop, I'm calling police. Are you planning to make your dad clean up the mess again? She says this with a voice so cold, it's like she's mocking him. Maybe he didn't believe she'd actually call the police because his fist clenches tighter. Without hesitation, she starts using her smartphone. From the speakerphone, you can hear the voice of a police officer answering a 911 call. He keeps asking, "What's your emergency?" The man lowers the fist he'd raised and clicks his tongue. "Don't run, Jenny." The man says this and runs off down the alley. She ends the call only after making sure he's gone. "We should move before the police arrive. You don't want any more trouble, right?" She grabs my arm to help me up, and then lends me her shoulder as I wobble. Her side profile is a real beauty, but with a hint of darkness. A pure yet mysterious beauty. By the time we reach a bench in a park away from the alley, we're both sweating. She made me sit on the bench and buys a couple of bottles of water from a vending machine. She gave me one and uses the other to dampen her handkerchief and gently wipes my face. I rinse my mouth with the water she gave me, but I can still taste iron. It looks like I've cut the inside of my mouth quite a bit. "We need to get you to a hospital. You're bleeding." She says this with a worried look while holding the cold handkerchief to my wounds. "I'm fine. It's not as painful as it looks. Are you hurt anywhere?" At my words, she opens her eyes wide in surprise. Then, tilting her head slightly, she looks at me in puzzle. Did I say something strange? Just as I was about to open my mouth again, her slender hand moved swiftly. Before I knew it, my suit jacket was whisked away. Excuse me. Suddenly stripped of my jacket, I was flustered. "I'll get it cleaned and return it. I'm sorry, but could you please provide your contact details?" She said this in a polite but firm tone. She quickly tossed over items that were in the pocket. When she found a business card holder in an inner pocket, she smiled. "I'll take a business card, if you don't mind." "Pardon me." She promptly pulled out a card, and she tossed it over to me. She took the business card, pausing for a moment. "I'll be in touch. A call from a college girl must be a nightmare. Give me your number." It seemed like I had run into a charming thief. As I told her my number, she repeated it without taking a note. She then introduced herself as Jenny Garcia. Just as I was about to say that the cleaning wasn't necessary, my phone started ringing. The caller ID prominently displayed my boss's name. The message was urgent. The CEO of a client company was drunk, and I was needed for help. "Sorry, I got some work to do." I left her in the park as I rushed off. It was regrettable, but I had no choice. She watched me silently from within the park until I hailed a taxi and got in. A week later, I received a call from the charming thief during my lunch break. She must have timed it to catch me on my break. I didn't recognize the number, but I had a hunch it might be her. "The cleaning is done. So when can we meet?" I told her I would be free after work tomorrow. "I'll send you the meeting place via text." And she hung up the call. The meeting place she texted was a restaurant I'm not familiar with. Her message sighed, As a token of my appreciation, let's have a meal. It's a restaurant picked by a college student, so it probably won't be anything too fancy. I prepared a bit of extra cash in my wallet and headed to the designated restaurant the next day. And now, I'm scared. The restaurant is not for students, and I was led to a private room hidden behind a concealed door. Frozen in place, I was sitting rigidly when she arrived a little late. "I'm sorry for making you wait," she apologized, bowing her head. I barely managed to respond with a weak, "It's fine." She sat down on the pulled-out chair like usually and ordered the chef's recommended course. Dishes that I've never tasted before appeared, delighting both my eyes and palate. Like magic, drinks were refilled at just the right timing, and the friendly waiter helped to ease my tension. The final dessert was served in front of me, and cheese was placed before her. Being a lover of sweet things, it was the best cake I've ever had in my life. You're not having the cake. I don't like sweets," she admitted, her face darkening a bit. "I used to be fine with it," she added with a smile. "Tastes change as we grow, and not every girl in the world loves cake." I simply responded, "Is that so?" and shrugged it off at the time. During the meal, we had all sorts of conversations. The guy who had bothered her turned out to be her fiancée, Ginny. She talked about marrying right after graduating from college, but she didn't seem